Sometimes, in 2008, a 21-year-old man named Part Engel had just poured himself a beer and sat down on the couch next to his girlfriend to watch some TV when he heard a knock at the front door of his apartment in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. It was late, around 8 p.m., and Part was not expecting any company, and so before he got up, he looked over at his girlfriend to be like, "Are you expecting anybody?" And she looked at him and kind of shrugged, and so Part just put his beer down and stood up and walked over to the front door to see who was there. And when Part opened up the front door, he was very surprised to see his mother standing there carrying a small duffel bag. So Part's mother lived in Middletown Township, which was located about an hour and a half away from Part's apartment, and while it was not unusual for Part's mom to stay over at Part's apartment, what was unusual is her just showing up unannounced. She never did that. And on top of that, as Part is looking at his mom, he could see clearly she had been crying because her eyeliner was smudged and her face was all puffy. And so Part knew clearly, there must be a problem here. But when he asked his mother, "What's going on, Mom?" she wouldn't tell him. She would just say, "I have to stay with you for the night." And then before he or Part's girlfriend could do or say anything, his mom just walked inside, walked down the hallway, went into the guest bedroom, and then shut and locked the door. And so Part and his girlfriend were left looking at each other like, what's going on here? 3 hours later, at 11 p.m., Part was in bed next to his sleeping girlfriend, just staring up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Part was so anxious about whatever was going on with his mom because where he was staying, his bedroom, was right next door to the guest bedroom where his mom was staying, and so he already knows there's clearly some issue here with his mom, but all night he's been listening to her next door just pacing and crying in this guest bedroom, and he has no idea what's going on. But deep down, Part knew that whatever was going on, it very likely had to do with his father, whose name was Arun Kumar. Part's parents had a complicated relationship. They had immigrated from India decades earlier and had settled in Pennsylvania, where they had 2 kids, Part and Part's sister. Part's father, Arun Kumar, worked as an engineer at Boeing, and Part's mother owned a 7-Eleven franchise. And basically, since arriving in America, the two of them had really come with nothing and had worked their way up to now to where they had a very comfortable life, kind of like the American dream, the house, the white picket fence, the kids, the whole thing. And so Part had always believed that, his parents, as a result of getting through so much hardship together, that they must truly love each other now. I mean, to have gone through all that together, that would certainly make 2 people very close. And for the most part, that actually seemed to have been the case, that his parents just got along great and were a great couple. That is until a couple of years earlier. Arun Kumar had started an affair, and Part's mother had caught him. Now, Arun Kumar said that, this affair meant nothing and he would stop right now, and Part's mother had forgiven him, in order to keep the family together. But despite Part's mom forgiving Arun Kumar, deep down, she just knew she could never actually trust him again. And so she actually wound up enlisting Part's help to basically watch Arun Kumar's behavior. She had Part set up the software that basically spied on Arun Kumar's computer. Through this software, Part's mom could basically watch Arun Kumar's email traffic and all of his internet activity. Now, Part had not felt good about setting up the spy software on his dad's computer. It just felt totally wrong to be getting in between his parents like this. But he just felt like this was the only way Part's mom was ever going to be able to actually move on. And so Part sort of felt like this was his responsibility. This is the way that the family was going to stay together. His mom really just needed that extra layer of transparency on her husband. Otherwise, the family was going to fall apart. But now, as Part lay in his bed, unable to sleep, listening to his mom pace back and forth in the room next door, he began to think to himself, maybe my mom found something using the software on my dad's computer. Maybe Arun Kumar had started another affair, and that was why his mom was now so upset. But just then, Part heard a new noise coming out of his mother's room. At first, it kind of sounded like low murmuring, like his mom was saying something to herself, but then he realized his mom was having a real conversation with somebody on the phone. And since Part couldn't sleep, and he was pretty intrigued about what the heck was going on with his mom to begin with, he decided to basically spy on his mom. So he very quietly got out of his bed and he walked around to the wall that lined up against his mother's room, and he put his ear to the wall and he began to listen. And what he heard was far worse than anything he could have imagined. What he heard his mom saying to whoever she was talking on the phone was that she had discovered that Arun Kumar had taken out $3.6 million in life insurance policies on Part, on his sister, and on his mother. And now Part's mom was saying to whoever she was talking to on the phone that she wasn't even worried about divorce at this point. She was worried about the physical safety of her and her kids. She was worried that her husband was going to kill her and her kids to get this payout. And so not long after saying this, this, Part's mom hung up the phone and went back to pacing and crying in the room. And Part, meanwhile, has just heard this horrifying news, and he had no idea what to make of it. I mean, he knew his dad was not a good husband, but the idea that his dad would want to hurt his wife or him or his sister just seemed totally impossible. But then, as Part's standing there just kind of processing what he's heard, he began to think back to these recent behavioral changes he noticed in his father that at the time he had kind of chalked up to, maybe my dad's stressed or something. But now, given the context of what his mom was talking about, Part began to wonder if these behavioral changes were a sign of something being terribly wrong with his father. The first change that Part had noticed happened a few weeks earlier. Now, Part's dad was normally a very mild-mannered and calm guy, but a few weeks earlier, he had gotten into this vicious dispute with their next-door neighbor over the property line that ran between their two properties. It was like he was picking a fight with the neighbor or something. And then, a few days after that, one of the bathroom sinks in their house had stopped working, and so Arun Kumar got out his tools and went to go break apart the sink and put it back together again, and because he was an engineer, this was something he did. This was typical behavior. But after breaking apart the sink, basically ripping it all apart and having all the parts on the ground, Part's dad didn't put it back together. He just left all the tools and all the parts just scattered across the bathroom floor. And considering that Arun Kumar was typically incredibly meticulous and organized, and he's this brilliant engineer, to Part, seeing his dad leave this sloppy mess and this unfinished sink, it felt totally off. And so standing there in his bedroom, totally horrified about everything he's heard and, now kind of second-guessing everything he knew about his dad, who suddenly seemed like this combative, kind of disorganized guy, Part suddenly felt like, I have to learn more here. I have to figure out if my dad really is a threat. So Part quietly left his bedroom and made his way to the kitchen where his laptop was, and he loaded up that software that spied on his dad's computer. And as he began logging into this program, Part was thinking, maybe I'm going to find something that will show that my mom is clearly just overreacting and misinterpreting what she's seeing, that, my dad is not, out to kill us for some insurance payout. But after loading up this program and kind of scanning through some recent activity, Part realized that actually the situation with his dad was way worse than his mom had made out on that call he overheard. He not only found all these multi-million-dollar insurance policies taken out on him, his sister, and his mom, but also he discovered this stash of fraudulent-looking paperwork. There were all these passport photos of his father, but then connected to these photos was a passport application that was using somebody else's name, as if his father was trying to forge paperwork to create a phony passport for himself. And so at this point, Part felt like his mother was certainly not overreacting here, that in fact it really did seem like his father was, preparing to kill his family and collect millions of dollars in insurance money, and then using this, fake passport he was making, he'd be able to flee the country. For the next several days, Part's mom stayed at Part's apartment, but she barely ever left the guest bedroom. And then when she would leave the bedroom, Part would go up to her and try to ask her, hey, what's going on, without giving away how much he knew already. But Part's mom was like, nope, I don't want to talk about it, and she would just go right back in the room, shut and lock the door. And so finally, after several days of this, Part just went to his mom's bedroom door, he knocked on the door until she answered, and then before she could kind of shoo him away, he said, Mom, stop, I know what's going on, I read the emails, and we have to figure out what we're going to do, because our lives literally depend on it. I agree with you, it looks like Dad is going to kill us and then flee the country. And so Part and his mom would talk through all the details of what was found on his computer, and ultimately they would decide that Part would be the one to go to police and tell them what was going on with Arun Kumar. And so the next day, Part went to the police station, with a stack of evidence that he believed would implicate his father, and Part was so nervous about this, he was shaking. But when he talked to an actual police officer, they looked over his evidence and they heard the whole story, but they told him, look, we really can't do anything about this. They told Part that, it's not illegal to take out life insurance policies on your family. And then also the police officer pointed out that in addition to Arun Kumar taking out those policies on his kids and his wife, he had also taken out a policy on himself and made his wife and his kids the beneficiaries of that policy. And so the police officer said, look, this does not look like a murder plot to me. It just looks like your dad is doing something fairly responsible. And then as for the passport application paperwork where his dad had used a phony name, the police officer said, look, he has not filed this paperwork, and so it's not illegal what he's doing. Anybody can get some paperwork out and fill it in with whatever they want. It becomes illegal if they attempt to actually pass it off and submit the paperwork, and as far as we know, he hasn't done that. So that's weird, but it's not illegal. And so Part had to leave the police station, and he went back to the apartment, and he told his mom what happened, and ultimately they decided that all they could do now was just wait and continue to watch that software that monitored Arun Kumar's computer, and just hope Arun Kumar would do something that was incriminating that they could then bring to the police and say, see, he's trying to kill us, and collect a payout and flee the country. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. Back in 2017, I had just gotten out of the military after 7 years of service, and honestly, it was a huge struggle trying to reintegrate back into civilian life. Not only was I totally out of the loop with modern technology, but I also had no idea how to get a job or even how to identify what a good job was. I just felt lost. And so that, combined with dark thoughts swirling around my head from previous deployments, made it so I really couldn't even function. And so before long, I was jobless, depressed, and angry. But I didn't tell anyone. Even though I had been raised in a household where talking about your feelings was a very normal thing. But now that I really needed to do that, I just couldn't. But luckily, my family and friends noticed the big change in my behavior, and ultimately they convinced me to go seek out professional help. And I'm so glad I did, because it was such a relief. Speaking to a neutral, trained third party about your darkest thoughts is so cathartic and really promotes healing. And while of course therapy is not some one-size-fits-all solution, it is a great starting point for anybody who's struggling right now. And a great option for therapy is BetterHelp, which is entirely online. All you have to do is fill out a quick survey online, and then very quickly you'll be paired with a licensed BetterHelp therapist who is trained to listen and give you unbiased advice. Let BetterHelp connect you with a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/MrBallen or select MrBallen during sign-up to enjoy a special discount on your first month. Okay, back to the story. Over the next few days, that Part and his mother every day just constantly checked this software and watched what Arun Kumar was doing on his computer, all they saw was Arun Kumar was using his computer to do work emails and really basic stuff, absolutely nothing incriminating. And in fact, over these few days, Arun Kumar would actually call Part's mom to ask her when she was coming back home again, and she would tell him that basically she was going to stay at Part's place indefinitely, and Arun Kumar did not seem upset or annoyed by this at all. If anything, it just seemed like he was really distracted and wasn't actually listening to Part's mom as she was speaking. And while this did seem kind of suspicious to Part and his mom, that basically Arun Kumar didn't care that his wife wasn't coming home anytime soon, it still wasn't incriminating. And so, Part and his mom decided to just continue looking deeper and deeper into Arun Kumar's computer to see if there was anything that could begin to explain what was really going on here. And sure enough, Part dug deeper and deeper into Arun Kumar's computer, and he did discover something. Part began finding all these emails with people back in India that kind of vaguely indicated that Arun Kumar was involved in a very sketchy deal, like a business deal. Now, again, the emails were incredibly vague, but what was clear in these back and forths in these emails was that it seemed like Arun Kumar had gotten wrapped up with some really shady people, and they were having these really nasty exchanges in these emails about this, deal that Arun Kumar seemed to be involved in. And so Part began to wonder if maybe he and his mom had this all backwards, that he, his mom, and his sister were not the ones actually in danger here, that in fact it was Arun Kumar who was in danger. Maybe because this deal, went south, and these people that he was doing this deal with, maybe they were mad at him, and so perhaps all these life insurance policies and this new fake identity were some sort of move by Arun Kumar to kind of flee the danger he was in. And so obviously, if this was true, this was still a horrible situation for their whole family, but it was markedly better than what Part and his mom had been operating on before, which was, that Arun Kumar was going to kill his whole family. And so pretty quickly, as a result of kind of thinking about this in a new way, Part's mother started feeling a lot better about the whole situation and actually left Part's apartment and went back to the house to go live with Arun Kumar. And Part himself began to think that, maybe this is not as big of a deal as we thought it was. I'm sure my dad will figure out whatever he needs to figure out here to get out of whatever mess he's in. And over the coming days, Part checked in with his mom every single day because now she's living with Arun Kumar, and she said everything was fine. And Part, he continued to check his dad's computer activity, and nothing else really popped up. It was still just the same stuff they had originally found. And so it just kind of seemed like, maybe this really is not as big of a deal as we thought it was. But on the morning of January 20th, 2008, so about 2.5 weeks after Part's mom showed up at his apartment, everything changed. On that morning, Part logged into his computer to check on his dad's computer using that software because he was still checking it every single day. And the first thing he saw was his dad had sent this email to this woman who Part didn't know, and this woman was certainly not his mother. And in this email, his dad told this person that he had a big contract coming up and he was going to make a ton of money from it. And then also at the end of this email, he told this woman that he loved her. And so right away, Part's thinking, okay, my dad is obviously having another affair because this is not my mom and he's saying he loves her. And also, what's my dad talking about with this big contract coming up? Is he talking about the insurance policies? Does he expect those to pay out soon, indicating that I, my sister, or my mom might be dead? And then also, the other thing that Part noticed that morning as he's checking through his dad's computer activity is he found another message his dad had sent out recently where he communicated to somebody that his father had died. So Part's grandfather had died. And also in this message, Arun Kumar is telling this person that he's going to go to his dad's funeral alone, that his wife and 2 kids were not invited to this funeral. And so Part's reading this, and he's totally devastated by the fact that his grandfather's dead, and the fact that he's not being invited to the funeral. But again, he's thinking, oh my gosh, is that because my dad thinks I'm not going to be alive? Is this all connected, between the big contract and the fact that we're not going to be at the funeral? Is this my dad thinking he's going to enact this murder plot soon? Part didn't know, but he felt like he and his mom and his sister were running out of time and he needed to act right now. And so Part got off his computer, he called his mom, and they made a plan. That evening at around 9:15 p.m., Part got in his car and began driving towards his parents' house to go confront his dad. This was the plan he and his mom had come up with. Basically, his mom would stay at Part's apartment, and Part would go and tell his dad, we know about what you're doing, and you gotta stop. And even though Part was totally jacked up on adrenaline as he drove towards the house, he felt like he really had the upper hand going into whatever this confrontation was going to be. Because, number one, Part was showing up totally unannounced at night to his dad's place. I mean, his dad's going to be caught off guard when he sees him. And also, Part knew he was much physically bigger than his father. Part was over 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds, and so he had the physical angle as well. And so Part really felt confident driving towards the house that he was going to come out the victor in whatever ensued. At around 10:45 p.m., Part finally arrived in front of his parents' house. He parked the car, he got out, he walked up the front steps, and he knocked on the front door. And a couple of seconds later, Arun Kumar came to the door, he opened it up, and he's totally confused to see his son standing there. And then before Arun Kumar could do anything, Part, in his deepest and most authoritative voice, looked at his dad and said, "We need to talk." And then he intentionally bumped into his dad with his shoulder as he walked into the house. And so his dad is standing at the front door, not really sure what's going on. And Part, after taking a few steps in, he abruptly turns around. And so now he's looking back at his dad. And he takes a step forward and gets right in his dad's face and says, I know what you're up to, I know what you've done, and you have a simple choice to make. You can either stop what you're doing and become the family man you're supposed to be, faithful to mom, or I'm going to go to the police and tell them what you're up to, and you're going to go to jail. Either way, whatever you're doing stops right now. And for a moment, Part and Arun Kumar are basically staring at each other in silence. And then Arun Kumar, before Part could stop him, basically ran past Part, passed him down the hallway, and he ran into the master bedroom, disappearing from Part's view. And so Part's turned around, and he wasn't expecting this. And suddenly, all that confidence he had going into this confrontation was gone. Because he's thinking, oh my goodness, my dad, maybe he's got a weapon in there. I need to get in there and stop him. And so Part, he turns and runs down the hallway. He darts into the bedroom, having no idea what he's going to see inside, but what he sees does catch him off guard. Arun Kumar is just sitting on the bed, doing nothing. He's just staring what looks like at the wall, and Part just stops in the doorway, looks at his dad, and then realizes his dad's not just absently staring at the wall, he's staring into the open bathroom. And in the open bathroom, on the ground, are all those tools left over from where his dad had been working on the sink and then never finished. Like, all these tools are scattered on the ground, including one tool that now Part is realizing his dad is looking directly at. It was a big, heavy metal pipe wrench. And suddenly Part realized, my dad is looking at a weapon, and he's considering whether or not to get that weapon and attack me with it. The next morning, Part's mother pulled up in front of the house that she shared with Arun Kumar. And she walked up the steps, went to the front door, she opened it up, and as soon as she stepped inside, she yelled out, hello, who's here? But there was silence. And immediately she got a bad feeling. But she knew she had to investigate. And so Part's mom began slowly walking down the hallway, the same hallway that Part and his dad had been fighting in the night before. And she went down the hallway and she turned and looked into the master bedroom, and she couldn't believe what she saw. There was blood on the carpets, on the walls. It was a bloodbath. And in the middle of the room was an obvious dead body that was so mutilated and destroyed, she couldn't even identify it. And so seconds later, she had run outside and dialed 911. It would take police almost 4 years to finally untangle Arun Kumar's insane web of lies and also make an arrest for the murder that took place inside of that house. And the reason it took nearly 4 years is because nothing in this case was what it looked like. Now, Part and his mother had been correct about a number of things about Arun Kumar. For example, Arun Kumar was having another affair, he had taken out life insurance policies on his whole family, and he was looking to obtain a fake identity. They were also right that Arun Kumar had become embroiled in a very shady deal back in India, but the specifics of that deal were not what Part and Part's mom thought it was. And when Arun Kumar announced in that message that, his father had died and he'd be traveling to India all alone, that his wife and his kids weren't coming, they weren't invited, well, Part and his mom had been correct, that this was a cover, this was an excuse for Arun Kumar to put his big plan into action. And Arun Kumar's big plan did involve murder, and so Part and his mom were right about that aspect of his plan. However, Arun Kumar's target for this murder was not who Part and his mom thought it was. They were not the target. Arun Kumar was going to murder himself. Or more specifically, he was going to pretend to kill himself. That was actually the shady deal he was involved in back in India. He was working with people who could help him fake his own death. And so what he was going to do is go to India, fake his death, and then once he was dead on paper, that would trigger an insurance payout of his own life insurance policy, and that money would go to his wife and his kids, and then Arun Kumar would disappear using his fake identity he would have, along with his mistress, the woman he was having an affair with. That was the person he had sent that email to talking about the big payout. But Part and Part's mom did not know this last critical piece of Arun Kumar's plan. They really believed they were the target of this big plot, that they were going to get killed, and so that's why they felt like they had to act first. So on January 20th, 2008, Part and his mother worked out an alibi for themselves. What they were going to tell people is that at around 8 p.m., Part went and picked up his mother from the house that she shared with Arun Kumar, and the two of them just went back to Part's apartment, and that was it. But in reality, Part never went over and picked his mom up and brought her back to the apartment. Instead, she was at the house with Arun Kumar when Part showed up at 10:45 p.m. to confront Arun Kumar. So it was him and his mom at the house as Part is demanding Arun Kumar come clean and stop what he's doing. And then at some point during this heated argument in the hallway, Arun Kumar turned and ran into the bedroom, and Part chased after him. And Part, he sees Arun Kumar sitting on the edge of the bed, and he thinks his dad is looking at the pipe wrench on the floor in the bathroom. And Part thinks, my dad is about to get that wrench and attack me with it. And so Part just acted first, and he ran and grabbed that wrench, and he beat his father to death with it. And then after leaving his father's unrecognizable, mutilated body just lumped in the middle of the bedroom floor, blood all over the walls, he and his mother just left the house and went back to Part's apartment. And then the next day, Part's mom went back to the house, and she pretended to find Arun Kumar's body, even though she already knew he was in there. And then she called 911 and acted totally beside herself when they showed up, as if she had just happened upon her husband's dead body. But almost 4 years later, when the truth finally came out about this horrible situation, Part and his mother were arrested. Now, both of them absolutely maintained that they genuinely believed their lives were in danger because of Arun Kumar, and they said during that confrontation in the house, Part was only acting in self-defense. He really believed his dad was going to grab that pipe wrench first, and so he had to do it before him, and that's why he killed his dad. But ultimately, Part would plead guilty to manslaughter, and he would be sentenced to 33 months in prison, and Part's mother would plead guilty to conspiracy, and she would be sentenced to 10 months in prison. Remember, we have a whole slew of strange, dark, and mysterious podcasts that are free under the Ballin Studios umbrella. All you have to do is go to any podcast platform and look up Ballin Studios, and you'll find the Mr. Ballin podcast, Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, you'll find Runful, Bedtime Stories, and our newest podcast, Wartime Stories. These are all incredible shows. They're all strange, dark, and mysterious, and again, they are free, so go binge. As always, thank you so much for your support. Until next time, see ya. As children, we are taught that there is 17, an electrician named Pete had become accustomed to doing work in basements and sub-basements of older buildings in Baltimore, Maryland. He discovered that many times when he worked in a stretch of older buildings right next to each other, that in the basement or sub-basement, there would be a stretch of tunnel that connected each building to each other, kind of like a common door in a hotel room. One day, Pete was asked to install some new lights in the sub-basements of 3 very old buildings that were all right next to each other. Apparently, someone had purchased the entire building complex after they had sat there abandoned for some time. When Pete arrived, his foreman, whose name was Mike, was waiting for him outside the farthest east building. And so Pete got out, walked up to the building, and Mike led him down to the basement and then down another flight of stairs into the sub-basement. The first thing Pete did was pull his flashlight out and look around and see if there was a tunnel connecting to the adjoining buildings, because if there was, it would make his life a lot easier. And sure enough, he shined his light to the west and there was a tunnel. And so he knew he wouldn't need to lug his gear up and over after he was done with each building. After that, Pete and Mike set up floodlights inside of that first sub-basement they were going to be working in, and then they put their gear on and they got to work. After a few hours of Pete being really focused on what he was working on, he looked up and realized Mike was gone, and he assumed he must have gone upstairs for a lunch break, and Pete, who had had a really big breakfast, wasn't that hungry, but wanted to take a break, so he decided instead of eating, he would just go explore the other sub-basements. So Pete walked over to that first tunnel that went into the second building. He walked through it. It wasn't very far, maybe 5 or 6 feet to get into the next building. Once he got into that second building, it was totally dark because neither he nor Mike had actually gotten in there yet. And so Pete pulled his flashlight out and he scanned around the room, and he saw directly on the other side, still going west across the building complex, was yet another tunnel connected to the third and final building. And so Pete walked through the second sub-basement, shining around, looking for anything interesting. There was nothing down there. He got to that tunnel, he walked through, and he entered into the third and final room of the entire building complex. And so he lifted his flashlight up and he scanned around the room, and he was shocked when on the other side, still going west, as if there was a fourth building, there was another tunnel. Pete kept his flashlight trained on this tunnel, and he's thinking to himself, did I get something wrong here? Is there really 4 buildings? Because I'm almost positive there was 3. There shouldn't be a tunnel over there because there's no more buildings. And so he's really intrigued, and so he keeps his flashlight up and he starts walking across the room towards this tunnel, and he gets about halfway across this sub-basement when he hears someone's voice come out of this mysterious tunnel, and it sounds an awful lot like Mike's. And Pete would say that his initial reaction to this was, oh, I guess Mike must have had his lunch break and then come back down here and started doing the same thing I'm doing, exploring the other sub-basements. And so he's already checked out this tunnel and he wants to show me what's down there. So Pete walks over to this tunnel and he shines his light inside, and right away he can tell it's different than the other 2 tunnels he's walked through, because those went straight across, and this tunnel he's looking at goes down and kind of bends off to the right. And so, totally unconcerned, because he believes Mike is down there already, he starts walking down this winding tunnel. After walking for a couple of minutes just straight down into this tunnel, he finally walks into this huge room with 20-foot high ceilings, and he lifts his flashlight up and he looks around, and there's no Mike, and he yells out for him. He doesn't hear him, but he noticed in the middle of the room were all these small animal skeletons that had been arranged in a big triangle on the ground. And as he scanned across the ground with his light, he came to the right side of the room at one of the points of the triangle. And at the top of that point was this large dog-like skeleton lying on the ground. It looked as if the triangle was more like an arrow and it was pointed at this one large dog. Pete went back to looking around the room and he saw right across from him was another tunnel entrance into more unexplored passageway. And for a second he thought about just turning around and leaving because this whole thing was starting to give him the creeps. But then he heard what sounded like Mike's voice again calling from that unexplored tunnel. And so he decided, okay, I'll walk a little bit farther to see what Mike wants. And so Pete carefully walked across this room, being careful not to step on any of the bones. And right before he walked into this new tunnel, he pulled his phone out in case he might have service and he could just call Mike and see what he wanted. But he had no service on his phone, so he entered the new tunnel. Unlike the other tunnel that went down the whole time, this new tunnel was totally flat, but it was a little bit more narrow. And so as he's walking, it's kind of zigging and zagging, and it's just getting a little bit tight on his shoulders as he's moving. And after a couple of minutes of walking and yelling out for Mike and not hearing from him, he just stops and he just thinks, is this a good idea? Should I keep walking down this strange tunnel, or should I just go back and meet Mike back up in the sub-basement? And as he's standing there facing away from the direction he just came, he thinks he hears something behind him. So Pete turns around and shines his light, and there's no one there. He yells out for Mike and Mike doesn't yell back. And then Pete hears the faint clicking sound of something moving on all fours in the chamber he had just come from. And he's thinking to himself, what could have gotten down here? There's only one way in and I've taken the other tunnel. Did I miss some dog that was staying in the middle there? I think I would have seen an animal that was moving around. And so as he's thinking about this, he realizes the clicking sounds have stopped. It's gone completely silent. And so he stops and he's just intently listening. And then all of a sudden, whatever it is out there starts running at full speed down the tunnel towards Pete. And so Pete immediately turns around and starts sprinting down this unexplored tunnel. All he hears behind him is this animal at full sprint, grunting and bouncing into walls as it gains on him. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, Pete gets to the end of this tunnel and he sees it's a small flight of stairs to a large metal door. He runs up and he grabs the door and he tries to open it, and it opens. He runs outside, pulls it shut, hears it click, and then he sinks down with his back against the door, pressing up against it to ensure it stays shut. And as Pete is sitting there, he hears this thing come barreling into the room where this door is, and it rams into the door, and he feels it shake the door forward, but the door holds. And then whatever it was just lost interest, turned around and left. Even though this animal appeared to be gone and the door appeared to hold, Pete stayed sitting with his back up against the door for a couple of minutes while he composed himself. He really didn't know what to make of what just happened, because he's thinking to himself, that animal had to have been huge. It just nearly barreled this door down. I felt the whole door shake. I mean, if that's a dog, that is a huge dog. And also, where's Mike? Mike's the whole reason I went into this tunnel in the first place. He was calling to me, or so I thought he was, and I never saw him. And so Pete's totally confused and he's traumatized and he's looking around and he's finally taking stock of where he is, and he realizes he's under one of the docks of what would turn out to be the Four Seasons Hotel, which meant he was at least about a half-mile away from where he had started in the sub-basement of those buildings. Pete stood up and made his way up to the sidewalk where he called Mike. And Mike was very confused at what Pete was telling him, because he said, I never went into that tunnel. I never went into the other sub-basements. At my lunch break, I just went upstairs and got a bite to eat, and when I came down, you were gone. And so Pete started talking about the animal he saw, and as he was describing it, he's thinking to himself how crazy he must sound, and he began to realize that it had to be, a stray dog got in there, and he just must not have seen it, and that was it. And so after they hang up, Pete is left thinking to himself, if that was a stray dog, then what were those bones arranged in that triangle for? And why did they seem to be an arrow pointing at that other bigger dog? And also, who was yelling to me inside of the tunnel if it wasn't Mike? But when Pete and Mike got back to those old buildings, they did not do any more exploration. It was like they were just not going to talk about what happened. Instead, they put a fold-up table in front of that tunnel that led down to the room filled with bones and whatever animal was down there, and they rushed the job in all the sub-basements, got all the lights up as fast as they could. The last thing they did was they moved the table back out of the way and then ran up out of the building and never looked back. There is a large abandoned factory on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio that used to be a prominent rubber company, but in the late 1970s, when they closed down business, nobody else leased the factory space, and so for decades it remained untouched. In the 1980s, a boy named Kurt was born in Cleveland, and from a young age, he was fascinated by this abandoned factory. He really wanted to see what was inside, but his dad would never take him, saying it was way too dangerous to go in there. And so over the years, Kurt still wanted to see what was inside, but his fascination with it kind of waned because he was never allowed to go. Then, in the late 1990s, when Kurt was in high school, he happened to be walking by the factory after leaving a friend's house, and he stopped, and he looked at his watch, and it was 8 p.m. He didn't have to be home for about an hour and a half, and he looked up at the crumbling brick building, and he thought to himself, you know what? It's now or never. I have to see what's inside of there. And so he walks right up to the factory. There's no fences around it to stop him, and he gets up there, and he sees that all the doors are sealed shut, and so he's a little bit disheartened, and he starts walking around the property, and when he gets to the backside, he sees on one of the corners of the building, the concrete has just fallen off, exposing a fairly large hole in the side of the building that he could just walk right through. And so he slipped through, and he looked inside this building that he's been thinking about for years and years and years, and he would say it was just so cool. There were all these boats that had just been left in storage inside of this factory and then were apparently forgotten about. There were all these conveyor belts and big pieces of factory equipment that had just been kind of left out on the floor, and no one thought to break them down or even try to sell them. And then, like any other good abandoned building, there was lots of drug paraphernalia scattered all over the ground. And so for the next hour, Kurt just explored the first floor and made his way up to the second floor where the manager's office was. And all in all, it was just a really awesome experience, many years in the making. And at some point, he looked at his watch and it was getting late, and he realized he needed to leave. And so as he was getting ready to leave, he could have sworn he heard the sound of music being played from somewhere in the factory. And so he stopped and he turned around and he just listened for a second to see if he really was hearing music, and he was. It was someone playing the blues somewhere in the factory. Because Kurt had obsessed over this factory for so many years, wondering what was inside, now that there was some mystery about what was in here, he couldn't just leave. He had to go look and see where that music was coming from. And so Kurt began walking across the factory floor in the direction where he thought this music was coming from, and he reached a wall that was covered by a big blue tarp, and that's where it seemed to be coming from, like it was coming from the other side of the wall. And so he went up to put his ear against this wall, and when he did, he almost fell into the tarp, because behind the tarp was actually a stairwell that led down into the basement. And so again, because Kurt was so fascinated by this place, he had to see what was down there. And so he grabs the tarp and he pulls it aside and he starts looking downstairs, and he can tell there's a light on down there. And so he's telling himself, okay, it's possible someone could be down there. But again, he's gonna go down, he's gonna have a look. He pulls the tarp completely aside, he steps into the stairwell, and he begins walking down. And from his perspective, he would not be able to see any of the basement until he got all the way to the bottom. There was no gaps in the railing. It was basically solid wall all the way down. And when he got to the bottom, he could only turn left. Turning right was just a dead end. Left was towards the main section of the basement. And so he goes all the way down the steps. His heart is racing because he's half expecting to see someone come running up to him. And right before he breaks the corner, when he can actually see into the basement, he takes a deep breath, and then very slowly he kind of pokes his head around the corner and gets a look inside the basement. It's a very odd scene in there, but there doesn't appear to be any people. And so Kurt took the last couple of steps down to the bottom, he turned the corner and actually got a full look at the basement. And sitting in the middle of the room is a cassette player with the play button pressed down that's playing the music. So he's found the origin of the music. And then he starts looking around and realizes on all of the walls are pieces of paper, hundreds of them, that have all been plastered to the walls that all say the exact same 3 words. She gotta run. They're everywhere. Then he looks in the back corner and he sees there is this large wooden animal sculpture, although he can't tell what kind of animal it is, but clearly someone has been hacking at it with a hammer or a saw or maybe both, and it's been burned. It looks like someone's been taking a lot of frustration out on it. And then in the other corner, away from this animal sculpture, was this chair that appeared to have been removed from a school desk. And it was angled towards the corner of the room. And then behind it on the ground was this massive stack of VHS tapes, and each of them had a woman's name on it. And Kurt, from a distance, could only make out one name, which was Jessica, but he could clearly see there was a bunch of other tapes with different names on them. Kurt suddenly was not feeling brave anymore and wanted to get out of there immediately, because at this point, he's pretty certain that whoever's down here is not a good person. They got some bad stuff going on down here. And so he turns around and he starts walking up the stairs. He makes his way across the factory floor, and he finally gets to the crack in the cement, and he makes his way out, and he's out to safety again. Even though Kurt was really excited about having finally explored the factory, on his walk home, it dawned on him that while he was there, someone had to have manually pressed the play button on that tape recorder that was playing the music, because it wasn't playing when he got there. So either he miraculously avoided ever making contact with this person or group of people inside of this factory while he explored it for over an hour, or the more likely scenario is as soon as Kurt walked inside, this person or group of people knew he was there and were watching him the whole time. And maybe when they hit play on that cassette player and started playing that music, that was just an attempt to lure Kurt down into the basement. Who knows what would have happened if he had stayed even longer? And who knows what's on those VHS tapes? To this day, Kurt and all of his friends are convinced he was in the presence of a serial killer. In 2013, three 12-year-olds named Paul, Tim, and Max were living in New Orleans. And even though they were too young to remember Hurricane Katrina from 2005, the devastation it left in its wake was around them every day. Just down the street from their neighborhood was a row of houses that had all been abandoned after they were destroyed by the storm surge. And Paul, who was the ringleader of the group, would routinely drag Tim and Max into that row of houses to look for treasure, but they rarely left with anything more than some old clothes and some broken kitchenware. One day, Paul told Tim and Max that if they wanted to find some real treasure, they would have to go looking inside of the abandoned hospital. Despite it being completely boarded up, windows, doors, and a huge fence around it, Paul said he had discovered an entrance in the back of the building. Tim and Max were not nearly as excited as Paul about this idea, because all they had heard about this hospital was criminals lived inside of it. They had also heard that the basement was completely flooded and basically the whole structure was not safe. But Paul was really convincing because he told them they were being babies. And so they said, okay, well, we'll go with you then. So the boys drove their bikes the couple of miles over to where this hospital was, and they eventually reached the big chain link fence that surrounded the entire property with no trespassing signs all over it. Behind the fence, they saw this ominous entrance into this underground parking garage that even from the street level, you could look down and clearly see it was totally flooded with gross, stagnant, dark water. But the boys carried on, and Paul led them to a section of the chain link fence that had been cut open. So the boys parked their bikes and locked them up, and then crawled through the gap in the fence and began walking up the small parking lot that led up to the loading dock of the hospital. As they got closer, Paul pointed to a shed that was situated right underneath a broken out window on the second floor, and it was immediately clear that people were using the shed to climb up and through that window. Paul was the first one to climb onto the shed, and then from there he jumped up and grabbed the ledge of the broken window and hoisted himself up and then very carefully climbed through. Once he got through, he turned around and yelled for the boys to come up. Once all three of them got inside and they began looking around, they were amazed at what they saw. There was all this medical equipment that had just been left out. Clearly there had not been an attempt at salvaging anything inside of this hospital. There were even blood samples still sitting out on tables. That day, the boys explored the entire floor they came in on, which was the second floor, and by the end of the day, they left with a couple of random medical souvenirs. Over the following few months, the boys kept coming back to the hospital and had eventually explored every room on every floor except for one, the basement. They wanted to go down there, but even Paul thought it was a bad idea because it was completely flooded with disgusting standing water, and there were no windows that went down into the basement, so it was totally pitch black. But by the end of the summer, they were getting bored with all the other floors of the hospital. They had seen everything, they had found everything, there was nothing left to explore. And so they decided, we're going to go in the basement. So one afternoon, they put on some dirty old clothes that they didn't mind ruining, and they made their way over to the hospital. They parked their bikes, they snuck through the fence, they made their way up to the shed, they climbed up into the second floor, they walked down the second floor hallway down to the flight of stairs, they went down to the first floor where the stairs stopped. From there, they walked over to an access door that led to another flight of stairs that just went down into the basement. And so they open that door up, they step inside, and they get their flashlights out because it's pitch black inside of the stairwell, and they shine their lights down the steps, and it was a half flight of stairs that led to a dry landing, and then there was another flight of stairs from the landing going down to the basement floor, and the final steps of that second set of stairs were completely submerged. So with their flashlights up, they walk down the first flight of stairs to the landing, they turn around and they stop and they shine their light into the basement. And what they see is just deep, dark, murky, standing water. And from their perspective, the basement was not some huge, sprawling, open space like you would imagine. Instead, they were looking down at a wall because there was this hallway that ran perpendicular to the stairs. And so it went all the way to the right and all the way to the left, but they couldn't see down either of them. They could only see basically the landing of the stairs. In order to look down the hall, they would need to go into the water and walk a few feet into the hall. And so as the boys are just scanning their flashlights into this murky water inside of this small segment of the basement that they could see, Paul finally says, all right, you know what? Screw it, I'm going. And he slowly walks down that final flight of stairs and he takes his first step into the water. And Tim and Max, they stay up on the landing. They're going to let Paul go on his own first. Paul takes another step. And another step, and before long, he says he's reached the basement floor and he's up to his chest in this disgusting water. And so he's keeping his arms high up out of the water, he's still got his flashlight, and he wades out to the point where he can actually look down the hallway in either direction. And so he looks down one way, and then he looks down the other way, and then he turns around to face Tim and Max, who are still back up on the landing, and he says, you can't see down either hallway. There's huge filing cabinets, and there's a generator down there, and I can't see in either direction. We probably can't go very far. At this point, Tim and Max feel compelled to go down there with their friend, and so they walk down that final flight of stairs into the water, and they wade their way over next to Paul, at which point they shine their lights down the hall. And sure enough, they basically can't see anything past maybe 5 or 6 meters down each hallway. As the boys were standing in the middle of the hallway, not making any moves in either direction, they suddenly hear something down the far right side of the hallway. And they shine their lights and they realize their view is completely obstructed, and whatever's made this sound, they can't see it. It's blocked by the generator and the filing cabinet. And as they're shining their lights, they still can't see anything. They hear a massive splash, like someone cannonballed at the far end of the hallway. And the boys do not stick around to try to get a better angle to see it. They immediately turn around and run as fast as they can, or as fast as the water will allow them, back to the steps, back to the landing, back to the first floor, back to the second floor, down the hall, out the window, and they run all the way back to their bikes. And by the time they're back there, they're panting, they're soaking wet, they haven't spoken yet. It was like intuitive fight or flight, and they were out of there. And they're sitting there heaving, and they look at each other and they start laughing. It was like this adrenaline rush. It was crazy what they were doing. And they look back up at the hospital and they're staring at the second floor window, almost half expecting to see whoever it was that made this big splashing sound to suddenly emerge in the window, but no one ever did. And after about an hour of just staring at the hospital and seeing no activity whatsoever, they convinced themselves that whatever they heard down in that hallway was probably just something falling off a shelf, or maybe there's a bird down there, but whatever it was harmless. Eventually, Paul says to Tim and Max that they should totally go back in there and try to figure out what it was that made that sound. And initially, Tim and Max are like, I don't really want to do that. But eventually, after Paul called them babies enough times, they said, okay, fine, we'll go back in the hospital. And so they go back through the fence, they walk up the parking lot, they climb onto the second floor, they walk down the hall, they go down the stairs, they get to that access door that leads down into the basement, and before they just fling it open, Paul gets his flashlight up, he turns the handle and he opens the door just a little bit and looks inside to see if anybody's in there. And there isn't, so he opens the door the rest of the way, and he, Tim, and Max go inside. Once they're inside, they shine their light down to the landing, and they can still see their wet footprints all over the steps. It's silence inside of the basement. They make their way down to the landing, they turn around, they shine the light into the water in the basement itself, and now the water is completely calm again. There's no motion, it's still completely quiet. And as they're standing there looking, it's clear all of them are hesitating. They don't want to go back into chest-deep, murky, stagnant water, and they also don't know what it was that made that sound. While they were outside, they're really confident it wasn't a big deal, but now that they're in this dark basement, it seemed a little bit more intimidating. And so Tim suggests they throw something into the water to try to get a reaction from whatever this thing is, if it's alive. But they didn't have anything to throw, and then Paul, out of nowhere, takes his flashlight and throws it into the water. And before Tim or Max could react to what he just did, they all just stopped and listened to see if that would cause a reaction from whatever it was down there. And as the flashlight sunk to the bottom and completely out of view because the water was so murky, there was no reaction down there. It was still completely silent. Paul turns to Tim and Max and says, the reason I threw it is now we have to go in because I have to get my flashlight. So Paul, along with Tim and Max, make their way down that final flight of stairs. They start walking into the water, they get all the way up to their chest in water, and they wade out until Paul is directly over the light. He can barely see it through the murky water, but he can clearly see it below him. And since he doesn't want to go under the water, he tried to use his feet to get the light up, but he couldn't do it. And so he looks at Tim and Max and he goes, "I'm going under." He takes a deep breath and he goes under the water. He immediately hears the muffled screams of Tim and Max up on the surface. And as he's fumbling for his light, he feels one of them yank on his shirt to try to pull him up and out of the water. Paul manages to grab his flashlight. He comes out of the water and he turns and he sees Tim and Max booking it for the stairs. And before he can even turn around and run after them, he realizes why they're running in the first place. To his right, he can hear the sound of something huge swimming up the hallway towards him. For a brief second, he raises his flashlight and shines it down the hall, and right at the filing cabinet, this dark silhouette that's in the water, that's lying horizontal in the water, is violently swimming up the hall towards him so fast there is a wake of water coming off of it. Paul turns and runs towards the stairs, or as fast as he can go. He's trying to wade through this water that's chest deep on him. He gets to the stairs, he runs up to the landing. He can see his friends are up at the door leading out of the basement stairwell, and they're yelling for him to hurry up, hurry up. They got the door open. Paul turns the corner and runs up to that door, and right as he's leaving, he can hear whatever it was that was swimming down the hall has stopped and is now on the stairs. He goes to the access door, and he and his buddies run upstairs to the second floor. They run down the hallway, they get into that room, they leap out the window, onto the shed, onto the ground, and they run all the way out to the break in the fence where they hop on their bikes and they bike away. And as they're leaving, they turn around to look, and there's no one. There's no one in the window, there's no one outside on the property. Whoever or whatever was chasing them is still in the hospital. The boys believe it was an alligator living in the basement of this hospital, but they never found out for sure. While they continued to urban explore around New Orleans, they never went back to that hospital. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please sell the like button a mogwai and tell them to give it lots of sunlight, bathe it frequently, and always feed it after midnight. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today's video is a collection of 5 fan favorite stories that all have disturbing photos associated with them. Now, these 5 fan favorites have all been completely re-edited for today's episode. So even if you may have heard or seen them before, it'll still feel like a brand new viewing experience. And for all you longtime fans of the channel, make sure you pay extra close attention to find the secret image inside of one of these stories. The first person who finds the image and can correctly Late on the morning of June 27th, 1957, a 25-year-old Austrian mountain climber named Kurt Diemberger plunged his ice axe into the deep snow ahead of him and then used the axe to pull himself up and over a big ice clump. Kurt was totally physically and mentally exhausted by this point and only wanted to stop for like 2 seconds just to catch his breath. But he knew that was just not an option. Kurt and his climbing partner, a 32-year-old man named Herman Buell, were climbing one of the tallest mountains in the world, called Chogolisa, which is located in northern Pakistan. And they were doing this climb all alone. It was just those two, and they had virtually no safety equipment. Now, for reference, this was not normal. Anybody who climbed Chogolisa did so with Sherpas and guides and oxygen masks. I mean, this was a dangerous climb, and so serious measures had to be taken to ensure it was safe. But Kurt and Herman felt like, that takes all the fun out of mountain climbing. There has to be, like real risk here for this to be worth doing. And also, critically, Kurt and Herman were well aware of the fact that if they successfully climbed Chogolisa with no safety equipment, so what they were planning to do, that would be a new world record because nobody had ever done that before on this mountain. And so that felt like a really cool reason to go for this. And when they began their journey a few days earlier, when they began the climb, it had still felt like a great idea because the weather forecast was perfect for the rest of the time they expected to be on the mountain. However, earlier that morning, Kurt had turned around to talk to Herman, and he noticed off to the south was a kind of ominous dark cloud making its way toward them. Now, obviously, when you're on the ground and you look up and you see a dark cloud, you think, okay, it might storm, or it's actively storming. Maybe it's rain, maybe it's snow, but it's probably not a big deal unless it's like a tsunami or a hurricane or something, but dark clouds are just not really a big deal. But when you are 4 miles up one of the most treacherous mountains in the world, you got no other people with you, you got no safety equipment, and you see a dark cloud coming your way, yeah, that's terrifying. Because storms have been killing mountain climbers basically for as long as mountain climbing has been a thing. And so when Kurt and Herman saw this cloud, even though the weather forecast had been good, they knew that there was a real chance a storm was going to hit them before they reached the summit. And so they had to make a choice. Abort the mission now, go back to camp, and potentially give up on this climb altogether, thereby not getting the world record. Or they could risk it and just try to speed their way up to the summit before the storm arrived. And because Kurt and Herman were actually within about 1,000 feet to the summit when Kurt noticed this dark cloud, they decided, you know what, let's just risk it. We can get up there to the summit, get this thing done before this cloud ever gets to us. And so that was the decision they made. And it was also why Kurt and Herman knew there was no way they could slow down even for a second, because basically this was a sprint to the top. And if they slowed down, they might die. So even though Kurt was totally exhausted from trying to make this last push, this is why he knew he could not stop. Stopping basically equaled death, because the storm will catch up and you're screwed. And so, panting and exhausted with the wind whipping up like mad, Kurt and Herman just kept moving up that mountain as fast as they possibly could. But when they got about maybe 500 feet away from the summit, so they're really close at this point, something changed. As Kurt was about to bring his axe back down into the snow to, pull himself up one more step, he suddenly realized he couldn't see the mountain in front of him. Like there was nothing. It was just pure white all around him. He couldn't even see the sky. It was like he was just in this void all of a sudden. And the reason for this is because that dark cloud had caught up to them. They were literally inside of the cloud. That's why they couldn't see anything. And so from behind Kurt, even though he can't see anything, he could hear Herman desperately screaming up to him, "Hey, we've got to turn around right now!" And Kurt obviously knew, yeah, it's too late. We are not going to make the summit. We got to go. Kurt knew Herman was right. I mean, this is an absolute crisis. If the storm that's basically brewing all around them didn't kill them, certainly the result of the storm would. I mean, all the snow that's going to land is going to fill in their tracks, and it would be nearly impossible to find your way back down again. And so this was like, we totally miscalculated, turn around and get out of here as fast as possible. And so that's what Kurt and Herman began to do. As fast as they could, they began going down the mountain, following along their tracks they had left on the way up. And pretty quickly, Kurt and Herman began making serious progress. And so Kurt was starting to feel optimistic that, maybe they had managed to escape this just in time. But right at that moment, the ground underneath Kurt began to vibrate. Then Kurt looked down, and even though his visibility was basically nothing, he could tell from his legs that the ground was basically shifting underneath him. And then suddenly Kurt felt this feeling that you get when you're on like a carnival ride and you're dropped, that feeling in your stomach that you're falling. He got that because the ground underneath him just gave way. It was an avalanche. And so in absolute desperation, Kurt, who knows he's about to be sucked into an avalanche, he just jumped, like as far away from the mountain as he possibly could, kind of at an angle to the right, like he was leaping up and out of the avalanche and over to the right. But you got to remember, he's on this really steep slope. This is not like jumping on flat ground where you jump up and just return to where you jumped from. He's on a slope. So when he jumped out and to the right, it was like he was jumping off a building. He fell something like 30 or so feet before he hit the ground again. But when Kurt hit the ground, he kind of expected to be gobbled up by the snow and keep being sucked down the mountain. But he wasn't. He hit the ground and didn't move. And then he kind of sat up and he looked around and he realized he had successfully jumped out of the avalanche. He had done it. He saved himself. And so he began looking around. The visibility is still terrible, but it's a little bit better because now the avalanche has basically gone down the mountain. The storm is kind of passing, and so the visibility is decent. And, Kurt, he's looking around, screaming out for Herman. He doesn't see him. And then it's like suddenly the visibility just opened up, and Kurt was able to look to his left where the avalanche had gone. And as he was looking, he saw what looked impossible. Basically, the land where they had been walking down this mountain was gone. It was like the avalanche had removed that part of the mountain. And so Kurt is basically laying in the snow on the edge of a new cliff where the avalanche had basically broken away the mountain. And so he's looking into this crevasse where the avalanche went and thinking, I can't believe how lucky I am, but I gotta go find Herman. And so Kurt stands up, and he's pretty battered from this 30-foot fall, but he's got adrenaline pumping through him, so he feels pretty good. And he scrambles his way 30 feet back up the mountain to this ridgeline where he originally jumped out of the avalanche, hoping when he got up there that he might find some sign of where Herman went to, because they were pretty close together when the avalanche started. But when he got up there was no sign of Herman, and he turned around and looked back down the mountain, and he couldn't see Herman anywhere. But when he turned back around, looking now back up the mountain, so in the direction of where they had originally intended to hike, and then where they had to come back down from when they were in the cloud, he noticed that he could see very easily their tracks, he and Herman's tracks. And so with his eyes, he just kind of tracked these tracks all the way down the mountain to where he was. And as he did this, he noticed something. At first, it was like his brain couldn't compute what he was seeing. But after a moment, he knew. Here is a photo of what Kurt would have seen. However, keep in mind, this was not a photo Kurt took, and it's also from a slightly farther away perspective. But conceptually, this really is what Kurt saw that told him what happened to Herman. So in this photo, you can see the mountain and the summits at the top, and there's a trail that goes straight down and then appears to diverge, where there's tracks that go to the left from our perspective, the viewer's perspective. They go to the left around that cliff line, and the other set of footprints that disappear off the cliff. Well, if you haven't figured it out yet, the footprints that go to the left are Kurt's footprints. He just magically jumped and landed on the absolute edge of where this avalanche was going to happen. And Herman is the other set of prints. And so when that avalanche started, there was nowhere for Herman to go, and he was sucked into that avalanche and dragged over 1,000 feet down the mountain, and his body was never recovered. In 2014, a 20-year-old man living in India named Maksud Khan had become completely and totally obsessed with tigers. His wife and his family weren't entirely sure what caused him to be so fixated on tigers, but they noticed after a kind of random trip to the zoo that he took that he came home and all he could talk about were tigers. So they figured he must have seen tigers at the zoo and just become totally enamored with them. But Maksud's obsession with tigers was not just, love and affection for these animals, although certainly there was that. It was more of a dark fascination with tigers' savage nature. The story Maksud used to tell all the time to his friends and family was about this tiger that was in captivity, and one day its two trainers had gone into the cage to put a garland of flowers around its neck for maybe some ceremony or something, and the tiger just wasn't having it that day, and when they went to put it on its neck, the tiger kind of snapped and killed the two trainers. Now, Maksud was not telling the story to kind of glorify the violence of it, or even to act like it wasn't a big deal that these trainers had been killed. He was telling the story with a reverence for these creatures that were kind of untamable, that even in captivity, they were in control, and he was just totally fascinated by them. In May of that year, Maksud lost his job, something that unfortunately happened all the time for him because he was known to be kind of lazy and kind of happy-go-lucky, didn't take things very seriously. He had actually been fired from a job one time when he was supposed to be unloading sacks from a truck and got distracted by some small animal and ran after it, and his employer fired him for it. But his family depended on him, and they said, Maksud, you gotta go out and get another job. And so during the day, Maqsood would go out and tell his family, I'm going out job hunting. But what he was really doing is spending the little money his family had to go to the zoo to go look at these tigers that he was so in love with. So for the next 4 months, Maqsood would just lie to his family and would go to the zoo and stare at the tigers in their exhibit. And so one day, when he was doing just that, on September 23rd, 2014, he was looking into the white tiger exhibit. Now, the way it was set up is there was an outer fence that all of the people who were at the zoo could stand right against, and it was an open air exhibit. Right on the other side of that fence, all the way around, was a little bit of land that protruded into the exhibit a little ways, and then it would drop straight down into a moat that was another layer of protection between the tigers and people, so they were not interacting. If you continued straight past the moat, it would go back up again to this little island right in the middle of this exhibit where all the tigers would spend all their time. For some reason that we don't fully understand, although one could guess that it was simply because Maqsood wanted a better look at the tigers, he climbed over that first fence, the one that no visitors are allowed to cross. And he walked to the edge of that piece of land that sits over that moat. And he's looking down at the tigers, and the guards are telling him to get back on the other side of the fence. All of the other people that are there watching the tigers as well, the other visitors, they're saying, hey, come back, don't do what you're doing. And at some point, Maqsood fell 15 feet into the tiger enclosure. Immediately, an alarm goes off, waking up the tigers in their habitat. So they don't know what's going on. They're kind of looking around. And the people that are watching this happen from the safety of behind this fence, they're screaming and yelling, and they're trying to get security to come over, and they're trying to save this guy. It's just chaos. But what's really happening is they're totally inciting the tigers to see what the heck's going on. And very quickly, one of the tigers notices that there is now a person, Maqsood, who's in the moat. And the tiger jumps down into the moat and walks right over to Maqsood. And Maqsood is sitting there and he's absolutely terrified. And people said that he was just praying, and he's huddled up against the side of the moat. And the tiger's just looking at him. The tiger's not showing signs that it's going to harm Maqsood. But the people that were watching this happen that are on the other side of this fence are either taking videos and pictures of the event, or some of them begin picking up rocks and throwing them at the tiger to try to, I guess, get the tiger to leave Maqsood alone. 10 minutes goes by of people throwing rocks at this tiger, and the tiger gets really upset. And so what do you think happens once the tiger gets upset? It attacks Maqsood. The tiger clamped down on Maqsood's neck and dragged him over to a grassy kind of hidden section within the enclosure. And by the time the staff finally showed up with a tranquilizer gun, it was too late for Maqsood. He was already dead. Here is the final picture of Maqsood after he's fallen inside of that moat. This is taken moments before this tiger would ultimately attack and kill him. The police would ultimately charge the zoo staff with death by negligence for their incredibly long response time and for not having any alternative rescue methods in place. John Jones and his family were avid spelunkers, which is a term given to people who explore underground caves. In November of 2009, 26-year-old John was back home in Utah celebrating Thanksgiving with his family. During his visit, someone in his family suggested they go cave exploring like old times as a way to kind of reconnect. And so John, along with his younger brother Josh, who was 23 at the time, and 9 other friends and family got together and headed off to Nutty Putty Cave, which was a very popular spelunking location in their area that no one in his family had actually explored. On November 24th, 2009, around 8 p.m., John and his brother, along with the rest of their friends and family, enter Nutty Putty Cave, and they make their way to this section called the Big Slide. It was not particularly challenging, and John, even though he had not been cave exploring in a really long time, felt like he could do something more difficult. So he and his brother decide to split off from the main group and make their way over to the most challenging section of the cave, known as the Birth Canal. So John and Josh start making their way over towards that section of the cave. They have a map and they're kind of trying to follow as best as they can. And John, who was leading the pair, stops when he gets to this waist-high hole in the wall that he believes is the entrance to the birth canal. When John was growing up and he used to go cave exploring with his family, he was much smaller. He was a kid. Now he's a grown man. He's 6 foot, over 200 pounds, but he still had the mindset of when he was a kid. And so like a child, he sees this hole and literally goes headfirst into it without any second thoughts. So John begins painstakingly inching his way down this tunnel that's completely tight on his body. His arms are pinned under his body, and with every movement he's making, he's getting tighter and tighter. But he's convinced that this is the birth canal, and that it just takes certain people that are brave enough to push past that discomfort, that claustrophobia, that if you just push past this tight section, you'll get to a place where it opens up. So John, believing this is the birth canal, kept going farther and farther into this tunnel until he's completely wedged. He has a little bit of tunnel still in front of him that actually kind of bends down in front of him. And he thinks, man, that's it. I just got to go all the way down there and I can get into that opening. And so he's caught up against a lip of rock that's underneath his ribs. And so in order to get past it, he breathes all of the air out of his lungs and he pushes himself just past the lip. And then he breathes in again, and his chest expands, and his rib cage is literally caught up on that lip because he's now moved past it. He can't bring himself back over the lip. And what's worse is as soon as he got over that little lip, he got a better view into this hole he was going down, and it dead ends. It just gets to a point. There was nothing there. It was not the birth canal. It was an unmarked tunnel somewhere in this cave. So he's trapped, and he knows it. And to make matters even worse, John was almost completely upside down. John yells to his brother and says he's stuck. Josh starts going down this tunnel and he almost immediately gets stuck. And from where he is, he can barely see his brother, who's way down this tiny little tunnel. And he knows that if he's stuck up here, his brother's really stuck. This is a very, very bad situation they're in. So Josh barely gets himself out of this tunnel and he yells to John that he's gonna go get help. But it would take 3.5 hours for the first rescue worker to arrive on scene because they are way down into this cave. This is not an easy to access area. Susie Matola was the first rescue person, and when she arrived, she said, "Hey John, how you doing down there?" And Susie would say that John sounded very distant, and he just said, "Hi Susie, thanks for coming, but I really, really want to get out." Susie immediately reassured John that she will have him out in no time, everything's going to be just fine. But when Susie looked down into this tiny little space that John was stuck in, she thought this is going to take a really long time to get him out. I mean, just to set up a pulley system to try to pull him out is going to take a long time. And then inching a 6 foot, 200-pound man out of this tiny space, that's going to take hours and maybe even days. But unfortunately, John didn't have the time. The human body is designed to be upright, with gravity helping your heart pump blood to the rest of your body. When you're inverted, blood pools in your brain and your heart cannot work fast or hard enough to get it out in time, and so it eventually causes your body to shut down. So when the trauma physician saw that John was inverted and he had already been there for 3.5 hours before rescuers even got to him, he told Susie and the rest of the rescuers that John maybe has 8 to 10 hours left to live. The rescuers tried everything to try to get John out of the cave. They put a rope around his legs and tried yanking him out. Didn't work. They set up an elaborate pulley system. It barely worked, but they kept falling out of the wall, and so it was taking all this time just to get set up, only to move him a fraction of an inch. They got drills and chisels, and they went down into the tunnel and began trying to chisel John out. But again, it was almost negligible progress, and it was just taking too much time. As the rescuers are doing everything they can to try to get him out, they noticed that John's breathing was becoming labored and his voice sounded nasally, indicating that more and more fluid was building up now inside of his lungs, and that probably they were within the last few hours that he was going to be alive. At some point, they finally got John to move just a couple of inches using this really elaborate pulley system that they had found a way to stay anchored in the walls, but they saw there was a huge problem. No matter what system they were going to use to get John out of this hole, due to the angle of the cave he had crawled into, his legs would not fit. They would not bend in the right direction on the way out. They would have to break his legs in order to curve him around this bend in the cave. With John's breathing already labored and him being basically unresponsive at this point, they figured that if they broke his legs, that would just send him into shock and kill him anyways. And so they realized that they cannot get John out of this cave. He's going to die here. 27 hours after John had become stuck, he became unresponsive and he was declared dead. The 26-year-old medical student would leave behind his wife as well as their 1-year-old daughter and his wife was due with their second child in June of the following year. Following John's death, Nutty Putty Cave was sealed off with cement, and John's body is still inside Nutty Putty Cave to this day. And here is a picture of John exploring Nutty Putty Cave before he ultimately made his way over to that fateful tunnel that he went in headfirst and ultimately died inside of. In 2019, 21-year-old Samantha Josephson was a senior at the University of South Carolina. She was a brilliant student who aspired to be a lawyer. Specifically, she wanted to practice international law. And so in order to do that, she needed to be able to speak other languages besides English. And so during her college years, she had really leaned into Spanish and become quite good at it rather quickly. During her college Spanish studies, one of her professors was a woman named Daniela Jaimes. Daniela very quickly recognized in Samantha that she had this incredible intellect and work ethic and just knew she was destined for greatness. In fact, she compared Samantha to Amal Clooney, who is George Clooney's wife and is considered to be one of the most famous international lawyers ever. And so just out of a general interest to see Samantha succeed, Daniela offered to Samantha to kind of be there for her if she needed anything beyond just Spanish, that she was there to help her with law school applications, or if she needed advice on something, or if she just had ideas she wanted to bounce off of her, she would be available. And Samantha had taken her up on this offer, and by 2019, in Samantha's senior year, the pair had become very close, forming a sort of mentor-mentee relationship. Early that year, Samantha got accepted into her target law school, Drexel University in Pennsylvania. And so after telling her mother and father, Samantha ran to Daniela's office to tell her mentor the great news. And the two hugged and laughed and celebrated right there in the office. It was clear that everything was falling into place for Samantha, and Daniela was just very, very proud of her. A few weeks later, on March 29th, Samantha decided to go out with her friends for some drinks. Now, Samantha normally spent a lot of her time studying, even on the weekends, but since she was about a month away from graduation and she was already accepted to law school and really didn't have that much work since it was the end of the year anyways, she decided she could cut loose for that weekend. So she, along with her friends, head out to this downtown area called Five Points, which is right near the University of South Carolina, and it's an area that's full of shops and restaurants and bars, so on the weekends it is packed with college students. Samantha and her friends hop from bar to bar, they're having a great time, and then around 2 a.m. the group found themselves in a bar called Bird Dog, and while they were there, because it was so crowded, the group of friends got separated. Now, initially, the friends were trying to reconnect with each other through texts and phone calls, but they were just really struggling to locate each other. And kind of in the middle of all that, Samantha decided that she was just too tired and didn't really feel like staying out any longer. And so she texted her friends and let them know that she was going to head back to her room. So Samantha leaves the Bird Dog bar on her own. She hops in an Uber and she starts driving back towards her campus. Several hours later, after all of Samantha's friends had also finally gone home and then woke up that following morning, they realized Samantha was not in her room. And so they called her, she didn't pick up. They started asking around to other friends who might know where she was, but no one did. And so pretty quickly, Samantha's friends were very, very worried about her because the last they had seen her, she was leaving the bar on her own. And so they were really worried something might have happened to her. And so by 1:30 p.m. that day, on that Saturday, the day after they had gone out, they called the police and reported her missing. At the same time that Samantha was reported missing, there were these two men who were in their mid-20s that were located 70 miles to the east of the University of South Carolina. They were out in this forest and they were hunting for turkeys. Earlier that day, these two men, whose names were Anders and Ryan, they had had no luck actually finding these birds, and so they were getting frustrated. And so by the afternoon, they had split up and were kind of combing this forest on their own to see if they would have more luck solo. And so Ryan, he posted up next to their truck, which was parked on this dirt road that was butted up against the edge of this big forest. And Ryan, with his binoculars, was scanning out across this field that butted up against the tree line of the forest, and he was kind of scanning the tree line, but he still was having no luck finding any turkeys. And then Anders, he actually had walked into that forest, which was right next to Ryan, and he was just kind of walking around looking for the birds as well, but he too was still having no luck. And so around 4:30 p.m., Anders, who's the one in the forest, he finally is just ready to admit defeat and leave empty-handed. And so he turns around and begins walking out of the forest in the direction of Ryan. And so at this point, he's maybe 100 or 200 feet away from Ryan, but the trees are very thick and they can't really see each other. And so Anders is just kind of walking in that direction. He's not looking for birds anymore, so he's not scouting around. He's just kind of looking straight ahead. And as he's walking, something catches his eye off to the left behind some trees. It was pretty far away, but he instinctively turned and looked, and he couldn't really tell what it was. It wasn't a turkey, but it wasn't anything that should have been in the forest. And so he decided he would go get a better look. And so he turned away from Ryan and went left and started cutting through the trees. And he kept walking until his view of this thing was no longer obscured by trees. And when he got a full look at this thing that had caught his attention, he stopped where he was. He yelled for Ryan, who couldn't see him, but he yelled for him to come into the woods and look at this. And as Ryan is running into the forest to see what's going on, Anders is pulling his phone out and calling the police. When the police finally show up, they find Anders and Ryan, and they're very shaken up, and they're sitting on the back of their truck on that dirt road where Ryan had been. And so the police pull up to them, they speak to them and get directions of how to get to what they saw inside of the forest. And then the police officers walk into the forest, they follow the directions, and before long, they're looking down at Samantha. 14 hours before her body was discovered, Samantha left the Bird Dog Bar and walked out front where there's lots of other students, and she walked to this corner of this road right in front of her, and she hailed an Uber. And then the Uber car pulls up, she hops inside, and then the car backs up and drives away. Except that was not an Uber car. That was a car driven by a 24-year-old named Nathaniel Rowland, who was not an Uber driver. He was a guy who had been driving around 5 Points all night, presumably to try to trick people into getting into his vehicle, believing it was an Uber. And finally, his plan had worked. He had pulled in right in front of Samantha. She thought it was her car. She climbed in without question. And then once she was inside, she couldn't get out again because the doors were child locked. There was no way to open them unless they were opened from the outside. Now, initially, Samantha wouldn't have noticed this. She just sat in the back seat, the car backed up, it started driving, except it didn't drive towards her campus. It drove the opposite direction. And the drive from this bar to the campus was only a couple of minutes long. And so even if she wasn't really paying attention, she would have recognized fairly quickly they were going the wrong way, because again, she's expecting to get dropped off within a couple of minutes. Now, we don't know what actually happened inside that car in terms of how Samantha actually handled this realization that he was taking her the wrong way. We don't know if she confronted him. We don't know if she tried to open the door and then realized it was child locked. We just don't know. All we know is that Nathaniel drove Samantha to some isolated area, most likely 70 miles to the east, near that forested area where her body was found. And then once he parked wherever he was, Nathaniel pulled out a knife and then leapt into the back seat of his car where Samantha was trapped, and he stabbed her 120 times. And then after he was finished stabbing her, it would take Samantha over 10 minutes to finally die. Within hours of dumping her body in the forest, Nathaniel was posting these normal posts on Facebook of him in front of his car and regular status updates, and he was having very normal interactions with his family and his friends, as if he was completely unaffected by this horrible crime he had just committed. Nathaniel was arrested within 24 hours of the discovery of Samantha's body. While he never offered any motive for the crime, it's believed he simply decided that night he was going to go kill someone. And so he just began prowling around for a victim, and unfortunately, Samantha was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nathaniel was ultimately convicted of her murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Here are the final images of Samantha as she climbs into Nathaniel's car. On the evening of December 29, 1986, a California Highway Patrol officer named Craig Pyre drove his cruiser down Interstate 15 in San Diego, California. With him was an NBC News reporter in the back seat, and there was a cameraman in the passenger seat. They were filming a segment about highway travel safety that was set to air on the evening news later that night. Officer Pyre was following his typical patrol route But after a few minutes, they passed by a sign that said Mercy Road. It was an exit. And at that point, Officer Pyre turned to the news team, pointed at Mercy Road, and said, that's where they found the body. So a little more than 36 hours earlier, at around 4 a.m. the previous morning, a 20-year-old college student named Kara Knott had been found strangled to death in a creek right near the Mercy Road exit. Kara had been on her way home from her boyfriend's house when, for whatever reason, maybe car troubles or maybe she was trying to help someone, but she wound up in that cul-de-sac, and then while she was there, she clearly encountered someone dangerous who took her life. And so this was actually why the California Highway Patrol and NBC News were collaborating on this news segment, because Kara's killer was still not caught. And so the idea behind this segment was basically to tell drivers along this highway how to stay safe while they were out there, especially if for whatever reason they had to stop somewhere along the highway, what to do in that situation. And so as Officer Pyre passed by the Mercy Road exit and continued down Interstate 15, he turned to the news crew, and as they filmed, he began talking about the basics of highway travel safety. Specifically, he said, look, one of the most hazardous things that can happen to you beyond an accident on the highway is if you have some sort of car trouble that forces you to stop on the highway. Because once you stop, there's an inclination for a lot of people to want to leave their vehicle. But that's a very dangerous thing to do. Officer Pyre also warned people not to get into a stranger's car, because there was a running theory at this point that perhaps Kara had gotten into her killer's car. As this particular segment was filmed, the one you just watched, Officer Pyre was looking ahead and he noticed there was a car pulled over on the shoulder of the highway with its hazards on. So he turned to the news crew and basically said, look, here's a chance for us to actually show the people in real time what to do in case your car breaks down on the highway. So he pulled his cruiser over right behind the stalled car, he got out, and then gestured for the news crew to come with him. Officer Pyre walked over to the passenger side door of this car, and through the open window, he asked the driver to get out and talk to him. The driver did, and as the camera rolled, Officer Pyre asked him to explain, what's going on here, what happened to your car. The driver said he had run out of gas and then gotten stranded on the side of the road. And then he had left his car and walked to a gas station to get a gas can, came all the way back, he put the gas into his car, but his car still wouldn't start. Now, at this point, Officer Pyre is realizing that this driver is doing basically exactly what he shouldn't be doing, according to the safety tips Officer Pyre had given. And so on camera, he basically says to this guy, do you understand how dangerous it is to have left your car like that and walked alone on this highway? Do you understand what a hazard that is? And the driver just kind of looked at him and shrugged yeah, I guess so. After that, Officer Pyre called the man a tow truck. His car was towed and the man was on his way. And Officer Pyre got back into the cruiser with the news crew and they carried on. After that, Officer Pyre and the news crew wrapped up filming. And then after he dropped them back off again, they told him what time to expect his segment to air on NBC that night. And sure enough, that evening, Officer Pyre was in front of a TV as the broadcast started. And when Officer Pyre's actual segment aired on TV, to him and to the California Highway Patrol, it went great. It was 1.5 minutes long. It sort of hit all the high points. It showed Officer Pyre, talking about how to be safe on the highway and talking to the stranded motorist. It kind of did exactly what they expected it to do. And when it was over, Officer Pyre clicked off the TV and didn't think much about it, because it was not a big deal. It was just a basic safety video. And for the vast majority of other people who watched this clip live on TV, it really didn't stand out to them. Again, it was just kind of a routine police safety video. But there were a few people, when they watched this clip, that noticed something very specific. And within an hour of this clip airing on TV, those few people were calling the police in droves to tell them, we know what happened to Kara Knott. And the police would follow up on these tips. And sure enough, just over 2 weeks later, they had gathered enough evidence that they were able to arrest Kara Knott's killer. It would turn out all the clues the police needed to solve the Kara Knott murder case were right there in that 1.5 minute long video. Because what happened to Kara had almost happened to over 24 other women in San Diego. And those young women were the ones who saw the news segment when it happened live, and they noticed this particular detail that clearly telegraphed who Kara's killer was. They were the ones who called police. On the night of Kara's murder, December 27, 1986, she pulled off Interstate 15 on the Mercy Road exit, and she came to a stop in that cul-de-sac. Now, we don't know exactly why she came to a stop in there, but either way, she was there, and that's where she encountered her killer. Now, the other 24 women who encountered the same person, the killer, they were terrorized and kind of tortured and held hostage for a couple of hours, but eventually were let go. But Kara wasn't. During her encounter, at some point, the killer clubbed her over the head and then strangled her to death with a rope. Now, the killer, at first, had gotten away with this, until they were featured on that 1.5-minute long video. And some of those women who had survived their attack, they're watching the segment, and suddenly their attacker is on TV. Now, they had previously reported their attack to police, but to this point, nothing had been done. And now they're staring at, for sure, the person who attacked them, who's right on TV. And critically, as part of this segment, they're hearing about how this other young woman had been attacked and killed on this highway. And they're thinking, oh, this person did that to me. I barely got away. I bet they killed this girl. And on top of that, as they're watching the news, staring at their attacker, they can see there's a fresh cut over their eye. And so put that all together and they thought, boom, that's the person who killed Karen Otts. And sure enough, the police would follow up on these tips and they would confirm that the man in the video with the cut over his eyebrow was Kara's killer. And Kara's killer was none other than Officer Craig Pyre. Officer Pyre was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Since being incarcerated, he has gone up for parole 2 separate times and been rejected both times. However, he is up for parole again in 2027. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell you 2 stories that highlight how the world around us and even our own eyes can play tricks on us. Sometimes what people see is not what's really going on at all. But once people have convinced themselves of something, it can be very hard for them to change their minds. And as you'll see today, sometimes that can lead people into deadly situations. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to, for free, beautifully detail the like button's car. But instead of doing that, once you have their car, just bring it to a huge cliff, put the car in neutral, and push it off. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications. Around 1:30 p.m. on the afternoon of May 18th, 2007, a 57-year-old woman named Yvonne de Hoorde arrived at a park in Rotterdam, which is a city in the Netherlands. She was there to meet up with her friend, and she had to cut through the park to get to his house. Yvonne went to her friend's house almost every day. And usually when she walked through the park during the week, there weren't that many people around. But on this day, it was really crowded because it was the Friday of a long weekend, and there was just a lot of families and visitors that were enjoying the spring weather, which meant the playground, the pathways, and the park's little cafe were all packed. But Yvonne didn't pay that much attention to the crowds because she was busy thinking about her friend. They'd known each other for years, and they had what she considered to be a very special connection that Yvonne didn't think she had with anybody else. Now, Yvonne knew that a lot of people might say her and her friend's relationship was sort of more strange than special. In fact, some people in her life actually openly disapproved of it. But for Yvonne, it seemed like the main reason for that was, Yvonne was generally pretty friendly and social and sort of an outgoing, normal person. But her friend was extremely reclusive and never left his house. And so it just seemed like an odd pairing. Her friend was originally from Germany, but even though he'd lived in the Netherlands now for years, he'd never learned the language. So he really couldn't communicate with anybody, including Yvonne, at least not in her native tongue. But for Yvonne, if anything, the fact that people didn't necessarily think this was a good idea for them to be friends just made her feel more protective of her friend. And also, she was especially sympathetic to the fact that her friend had actually been abandoned by his mother as a child. And so in a way, she sort of felt like she was stepping in as sort of a maternal figure in her friend's life. And so Yvonne, she rounded a corner on the park's path, and up ahead, there was her friend's house. And she could actually see her friend through one of the windows. And he did not look particularly happy. He looked sort of dejected. And so as she approached, she made a big scene to be very smiley and happy, and she's waving to her friend. And sure enough, her friend at some point turned and looked out the window and saw Yvonne approaching, and he broke into a big smile and he waved back. It's like, even though they didn't speak the same language, there clearly was a connection there. And Yvonne was just filled with happiness, so glad that she was here to see him. And so Yvonne, she made her way over to her friend, and that day really was spent the same way they spent all their other days together, which, again, they don't speak the same language, so it was just sort of a lot of, body language and gestures and sort of just sitting together and just sort of enjoying each other's company. There wasn't really any direct communication happening, but this was a unique relationship, and for Yvonne, whatever it was enough for her. And she felt like for her friend, it was reciprocated. He appreciated their time together, and that was enough. But even though Yvonne in particular really looked forward to these visits and was having a really nice time on this particular day, she couldn't stay forever. She had a family and other things she needed to get done. So at around 2:30 p.m., after having spent about an hour with her friend, she said goodbye to him, and then she turned and left, knowing that the two of them would see each other again soon. And so Yvonne, after turning and leaving her friend's house, she only got a few steps down the path she came in on when two things happened at once. The first thing was she noticed there was a group of kids in the park who were throwing rocks, and she knew instinctively, like, the kids should not be throwing rocks. So that sort of registered. She wasn't doing anything about it, but she was just aware that there are children throwing rocks nearby. And then the second thing she noticed is she heard splashing coming from behind her. She didn't think it was coming from the kids throwing rocks. She's thinking it didn't rain anytime recently, so there's no reason that there'd be splashing sounds around her. There's no puddles or anything. The only splashing that made sense was it was coming from this stream that was sort of off limits in the park. Nobody had access to it. There was no reason to get down there to that stream, but it sounded very much like that was the splashing that she was hearing. And so Yvonne, she's just consciously aware of these things happening. This was not something that was alarming. She's just aware. And so she found herself turning around to see in particular what that splashing sound was. And as she turned around, something huge smashed into her, pinned her to the ground. All she could hear was screaming throughout the park. And the last thought she had before she blacked out was, "Oh my God, I'm about to die." Not far away, a man named Arvid Hendricks, who had also come to this same park with his wife and his two kids, heard the screams echoing through the park. He was right outside the cafe that Yvonne had been walking towards, and he had just been about to go inside when all this commotion had started. So this particular cafe sat on a path that cut through the park itself. It was a small place, almost like a glorified snack bar, and it had a big pavilion right in front of it with outdoor seating that looked out over the park. And from Arvid's perspective, as he was standing on that pavilion near the cafe entrance, he could hear these people screaming and actually started to see them running in his direction. But Arvid had no idea what they were screaming about or what they were running from. It just seemed like all of a sudden everybody's panicking and coming this way. And so instinctively, Arvid's thinking, okay, there's something threatening going on, and he needs to make sure his family is safe before he even knows what the threat is. So he grabbed his kids and his wife, and he ran into the restaurant along with everybody else. And remember, this restaurant, this cafe, was not huge. Inside, it sort of felt like a dining hall with large communal tables. And so with all these people rushing inside, this place quickly became chaotic. And then after all these people came inside, a few of the people went forward and did their best to barricade the front doors. Even though they were glass and would be pretty easy to break through, they did what they could to sort of block them off. After this, despite there still being this really intense energy sort of buzzing around the room, things actually kind of calmed down. Arvid and probably many other people in this cafe did not know what was going on. They had just sort of reacted instinctively and went in here, assuming there has to be some real threat out there. Let's take shelter. And so there's this weird lull period where everyone's kind of looking around, Arvid included, trying to figure out, is there really a big threat out there, or are we overreacting here? And as they're all sitting there kind of wondering what's going on, the front doors, the glass doors, suddenly shatter. And once again, the whole group is thrust into absolute chaos once again as all the parents are grabbing their kids, and even though they still don't really know what's going on, they're trying to rush towards those shattered doors to get out of this place, which now feels like it is dangerous, in some ways worse than outside. And so it's this huge bottleneck as the door, as everyone's screaming, there's just madness happening. And Arvid, he could tell there was no way he could get through this cluster of people desperately trying to get out. And so he just grabbed his wife and his kids, and they went under one of the tables and they hid. And for the next couple of minutes, everything all around Arvid and his family continued to be absolutely chaotic and madness. But then eventually, everything just went quiet as everybody else made their way out of the cafe. And it was just Arvid and his family sitting there wondering what the heck is going on. And for a moment, Arvid felt like, okay, I'm safe. I don't know what's going on, but me and my family, we are safe. However, before he instructed his kids and his wife to come out of their hiding spot, he heard the sound of more glass shattering, and then he heard these loud stomping sounds as something huge was making its way through those front doors into the cafe. And suddenly it hit Arvid when he looked out and saw what it was, why everybody was running. And he also realized that he and his family were now trapped. It would turn out all the people in Yvonne's life who frowned on her special friendship had been right to do so. Because although Yvonne loved her daily routine with her friend did not actually feel the same way. Every day when Yvonne went to visit, she would sit with her friend and keep him company. And Yvonne's friend would smile back at her. This was sort of the rapport they had developed, at least in Yvonne's mind. The smiling back and forth suggested they were friends. What Yvonne didn't realize is that them smiling back and forth was actually something her friend hated. And on that particular Friday afternoon, her friend was already in a very bad mood. The park that surrounded his house was so crowded and so loud, and those kids who Yvonne saw throwing rocks when she left had been doing it earlier. They were throwing rocks that whole time that she was visiting with her friend, and some of those rocks were hitting her friend's house, and it was making him so agitated and mad. And then the whole time through this interaction, Yvonne is smiling over and over at her friend, thinking this is so great, and it just totally sent her friend over the edge. And so when Yvonne finally left and walked away, the friend, should have felt relieved because now, one of the things that was really agitating him was gone. Yvonne, she was gone. But the friend knew she wasn't really leaving for good. She would just come back tomorrow like she always did with that same enraging smile on top of all the other things that were so annoying. And the friend just could not take it any longer. So he snapped. He stormed out of his house, splashing through that off-limits stream in the park to get to Yvonne as she walked away. And just before he reached her, she turned around and saw him. This time, he smiled at Yvonne before she could smile at him. And for once, she didn't smile back. Instead, she looked terrified. And this was because Yvonne's friend was a 400-pound silverback gorilla named Boquito, and the park he lived in was a zoo. To silverback gorillas, smiling is not a sign of friendship. It's a sign of aggression and hostility. So it's very likely that from Boquito's point of view, almost every day for years, Yvonne had been coming to his enclosure, in essence, to threaten him. At least that's very likely how he interpreted it. And he had been basically threatening her back whenever he smiled by showing his teeth. And he thought maybe that would get her to go away, but it never worked. She always came back and just continued to threaten him. And so eventually, like the story goes, it became too much. Luckily though, Boquito didn't harm really anybody except for Yvonne. He bit her over 100 times and broke multiple bones, but Yvonne did survive. But no other guests were harmed, including Arvid and his family. They were trapped in that cafe with Boquito, who after attacking Yvonne had charged in there and was walking around, but Boquito never attacked. And so at a certain point, Arvid and his family were able to run to safety. After she recovered, Yvonne would tell the media that Boquito was still her darling. That's what she called him. And in fact, she would go back to the zoo to see Boquito after that. But this time, she didn't smile. At 3 a.m. on August 11, 1965, a 19-year-old student named Ali Dogan sat in the front seat of a passenger bus as it headed down a dark, narrow road in northwest Turkey. Ali and about 50 other passengers were on their way from the city of Ankara to Istanbul, which is the largest city in Turkey, and they were about 3 hours into a 5-hour trip. Ali had passed the time so far by speaking with the man who just happened to be sitting next to him. He was an Air Force lieutenant. The lieutenant told Ali that originally he had actually been booked to take a flight to Istanbul, but he had missed the flight, and so here he was on the bus. But he told Ali that actually he was really enjoying this bus ride. He had never been on a long bus ride before, and critically, he had scored the very front seat in the bus, so he could basically see out the front window of the bus. And so for him, that was kind of exhilarating. And for Ali, he had actually switched spots with a previous passenger who had been sitting next to the lieutenant when they first boarded. He had switched with that person because Ali, the reason he was switching, was he wanted that view too. And so he and this lieutenant were sort of bonding over their shared excitement over, watching the road as they drove for hours on end. Ali and the lieutenant spoke in very quiet voices since almost everybody else on the bus was fast asleep. But these two, they're pumped, they're watching the road, they're talking about it quietly. But at a certain point, Ali, despite his enthusiasm for this ride, he started to feel pretty drowsy too. Ali was on his way back to Istanbul where he went to college. And later that day, because right now it's 3 a.m., later that day, he had a big exam. And he knew that as much as he wanted to stay up and sort of enjoy the ride, he really needed to get some sleep. So he took his sweatshirt and rolled it up like a pillow, put it behind his head, told the lieutenant he was going to sleep for a bit, and then he put his head back and closed his eyes. However, about 15 minutes later, when Ali was just really beginning to actually fall asleep, the bus was suddenly filled with screams, and Ali, he opened his eyes and he was looking out forward in the direction the bus was going, and he saw these bright headlights bearing down on the bus, and he knew they were about to collide with somebody on the road, and then the bus hard swerved to the right, and Ali's trying to hold on to the partition to keep himself seated, and he's getting ready to smash into this other vehicle, but right at the last second, the bus turns and slams off the road and comes crashing down in this ditch right off the side of the road. And then the bus kind of lurched to a stop because the bus driver was able to stop the crash. And for a second, Ali's looking around, everyone's so shaken up by this, and he's feeling, very relieved that they did not smash into an oncoming car. But despite feeling that relief, Ali quickly realized they had another problem. The bus was starting to fill with smoke. And so Ali and the lieutenant, in virtue of sitting at the very front of the bus, were the closest to the door leading off the bus. And now clearly everybody needs to evacuate. There's some kind of fire that's happening because of the crash they've just been in. And so Ali and the lieutenant, they stand up, and the bus is kind of at a slant here because they're in this ditch, and they go up to the very front of the bus, and they actually look out the cracked front windshield, and they see there's this huge truck also in the ditch on the side of the road, and they're figuring that they must have collided in some way, like that was the truck that forced the bus off the road. And so it's like, okay, they've gotten into this accident. There's clearly a fire. We just got to get off this bus. And so Ali and the lieutenant, they get to the door and they try to open it. But the way the bus kind of crashed into this ditch, it sort of warped the frame of the bus. And so the lieutenant, he got down there and he began smashing on this door to try to open it up. And as this is happening, the smoke is getting much more intense inside of this bus, and all the people on the bus, the 50 some odd passengers behind them, they're starting to panic. Everyone's rushing forward, bumping into Ali and the lieutenant, trying to get off this bus. And then finally, the lieutenant, he manages to force open the doors. And the second he does, this additional rush of black smoke comes pouring into the bus. It's like you can't even see anything. Everyone's choking and screaming. And the lieutenant, he just yells to Ali to go, get out, jump out. And so Ali, he's the first one off the bus. He climbs down the steps. All he sees is smoke everywhere. He really has no idea where the fire is actually coming from. And so instinctively, he just jumps out of the bus, just jumps as high and as far as he possibly can. And he actually hits the other side of the ditch. And he kind of stumbles and climbs up and gets away from the bus. And as soon as he did, he turned around and he's looking at the bus, and it's nighttime, but even still in the darkness, he just sees the bus is completely engulfed in all this smoke. He can't quite tell where the fire is. He's thinking, the engine must have caught fire and it's spreading across the undercarriage of the bus, but it's getting so bad
and he's hearing all the people on board desperately trying to get off out that door the lieutenant had forced open. But there's some kind of bottleneck. They're not getting out. It's like they're stampeding towards the front of the bus. People are screaming. It's chaos. And then Allie hears some of the windows being pushed open. People start jumping out the windows. I mean, they are desperate to get off this bus. And at first, what Allie hears are screams of what sounds like desperate and scared people just trying to evacuate. But quickly, those screams, when the folks started coming out of the bus, turned to pure agony. But as Allie is listening to this and watching this disaster unfold, he's thinking, okay, well, the reason they're screaming is because it's possible they could be catching on fire here, or maybe, they're jumping off and breaking bones or getting hurt from leaping out the window, and that's all terrible. But people are getting out of this bus, and before long, they're going to come up and over that side of the ditch, and they're going to join me. Like, these people, they're coming out of the bus. I'm seeing it happen. But all that happened is the screams of agony got louder and louder, and nobody came over that ditch. It was Allie all alone, and he had no idea why. All he sees is smoke, and all he hears is screams. And then at some point, authorities show up, and they clearly are right into the fray, trying to extinguish whatever fire is going on and trying to get people out and away from the bus. But despite this huge effort that Allie's watching happen right in front of him, granted it's obscured by the smoke, still nobody, including the lieutenant, came over the ditch to come be with Allie. He was all alone. But eventually, Allie noticed a few of the authorities that had shown up to assist in this emergency were walking away from the smoke in the bus, carrying what appeared to be bodies. But as Allie stared at these people carrying these bodies, he realized they weren't whole bodies. They were body parts. It would turn out most of Allie's and the rest of the passengers' assumptions about exactly what happened in that crash were correct. The bus they were riding in did swerve after seeing the headlights of an oncoming vehicle, and it did hit that big truck they saw on the side of the road when Allie and the lieutenant first got to the front of the bus and looked out. That was the truck they hit. Now, it was not a head-on collision. It was sort of a glancing blow as the bus swerved to avoid a head-on collision, but that crash sent the bus off the road into the ditch, and it was that crash into the ditch that ultimately prompted all that smoke. But they were all wrong about what was causing that smoke. There was no fire. The truck that the bus narrowly avoided the head-on collision with, but did ultimately strike, causing both the bus to crash and the truck to crash, that truck was a shipping truck, and it was transporting a huge amount of freight to Istanbul. And the collision burst the truck's shipping containers, and so the contents of those containers, the freight itself, poured out into that ditch. And that ditch that basically the bus had landed inside of, that Allie had sort of jumped over on his way to get out of the bus, and that others were sort of falling into when they were coming out of the bus to avoid this, fire, or so they thought. It already had some water in it when that freight entered into the ditch. So the freight and the water combined. And that combination caused a chemical reaction, and that chemical reaction caused the smoke. Because that freight was nitric acid, a highly corrosive, highly toxic liquid chemical that now, despite being diluted by the water in the ditch, had basically filled the ditch. The ditch is now effectively an acid bath that's smoking, giving the impression the bus is on fire. And so all these folks are leaping out of the bus and landing in the ditch, which again is an acid bath, and they're being dissolved by the acid. Allie, when he left the bus first, he leapt out of the bus. He thought there was the fire right there, and he jumped up and out trying to clear the fire. And what he really did is he cleared the acid bath and landed on the other side, avoiding dissolving in the acid. But virtually everybody else in the bus was going right into the acid. And so in the end, of the nearly 50 people on board that bus, 26 literally dissolved to death. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. On December 30th, 2016, a woman sat down at her computer in her New Mexico home and pulled up the video feed from her surveillance system. Everybody in her neighborhood was terrified. There was a killer on the loose, and the police did not seem to have any idea who it could be or what their motivation was. So, on her computer, she scrolled back 2 days and began going through the footage frame by frame, looking for anything suspicious. And for a while, really nothing stood out on this recording. The only thing that really happened was her neighbor came home from a trip at some point, and then some time passed, and then the neighbor... On the evening of December 28, 2016, a 54-year-old man named Don Fluitt drove down the highway into the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Beside him was his 11-year-old daughter, Sienna, who had fallen asleep in the passenger seat. They'd been driving for nearly 12 hours, all the way from Don's mother's home in California, where they'd just spent Christmas. But the holiday had not really been a happy one, because a few weeks earlier, Don's sister, Janice, had died of breast cancer. And Janice was really one of the only true close family members Don had left. His dad and his other sister were both already dead, and his younger brother Dennis wasn't talking to him after a big argument the year before. So, as soon as Don had gotten the news that Janice had unfortunately passed away, he'd immediately negotiated with his ex-wife to take their daughter, Sienna, and go see his mom. He wished they could have stayed longer, but he had to get back to work. Don had a job at an agency that served the developmentally disabled, and there was a big meeting coming up that he just couldn't miss. Just then, Don slammed on his brakes. Traffic ahead was piling up, and the car in front of him had slowed down to an abrupt stop. Don felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, and he laid on his horn. He was about to roll down the window so he could scream at the driver in front of him, but then he saw Sienna open her eyes in alarm in the seat next to him, and he stopped himself. Don took a deep breath and reminded himself that it was just traffic, and it wasn't worth getting angry about. Don used to have kind of a temper when it came to driving, but in recent years, he'd been working hard to control it so he could set a good example for his daughter. So after the traffic finally let up, and as he rounded an exit off the highway and drove through downtown Albuquerque toward his house, Don deliberately tried to shift his focus to something positive. It was already Wednesday, which meant it was only a few more days until Spaghetti Sunday. And that always made Don smile. Spaghetti Sunday was a tradition that he and Sienna had started together a few years ago by making big batches of food every Sunday after church and bringing the food downtown to feed the homeless. At first, it had just been the two of them, but over time, more people had joined in the effort, and pretty soon it had grown into a real event with whole groups of volunteers coming out to serve food and drop off clothes and canned goods. Don felt proud that he'd created something so meaningful for the community, and it was especially important to him that he had done it with Sienna. Finally, Don turned down a quiet residential street and parked in the garage of a 2-story stucco townhouse decorated with Christmas lights. He got out of the car with Sienna, grabbed their suitcases, and walked to the front door and unlocked it. And when his daughter stepped inside, she shrieked with excitement, because waiting for her under the Christmas tree was a brand new bicycle wrapped in a shiny bow. She turned around and asked her dad if she could give the bike a spin around the block right now. Don wanted to say yes, but it was already dark out, and this was supposed to be a quick stop at his house, and when he looked at the clock, he saw that it was almost 7. He'd already had Sienna for most of December, including the whole holiday, and he had to get her back to her mother's house soon. Don and his ex-wife, Christine White, had a pretty civil relationship, but he knew she would be annoyed if he asked for more time. So Don told Sienna the bike would have to wait, but for now, just go grab whatever she needed from her room, and then they would leave. As Sienna ran off, Don noticed something strange. He hadn't seen his golden retriever, Buddy, who usually rushed out to greet him whenever he came home. So Don walked through the living room and down the hall, calling out Buddy's name, and finally found the dog cowering in the bedroom. Don extended his hand, and Buddy skittishly came forward to sniff it. And Don was a little unnerved by this. Buddy usually did not act scared of him. But then again, Don didn't usually leave for weeks at a time either, so he just told himself that, maybe this was just separation anxiety. So he gave Buddy a pat on the head, filled his bowl with kibble, and then grabbed his keys for the short drive to his ex-wife Christine's house. Don drove to Christine's very slowly, trying to enjoy every last bit of his time with Sienna. Don treasured the time he had with his daughter, because the mistakes he'd made when he was younger had almost gotten her taken away from him. These days, Don lived a squeaky clean life and went to church every Sunday, but it was not always that way. He had partied a lot when he was younger, and when Sienna was a toddler, he'd gotten fired from his dream job as a firefighter for failing a drug test. And then after he'd lost his job, his then wife, Christine, had to shoulder most of the family's bills, and after a few months, the strain on the marriage was just too much. Christine filed for divorce, which was crushing for Don, but even worse was the possibility of losing Sienna. Don actually already had 2 kids from a previous marriage, and after that divorce, his first wife had gotten sole custody of those kids and moved them all to Oklahoma, so Don had barely seen them for most of their childhoods. He was determined not to make that same mistake with Sienna. So he'd gone to court to fight Christine and her new husband, Terry White, for shared custody. The court battle had gotten a little contentious, but it was worth it, and Don made the most of every moment he got to spend with Sienna. He'd braid her hair before school and make costumes for her school plays, and on the nights when she was at her mom's house, he always called her before bed to say goodnight. Now, Don pulled into Christine and Terry's driveway, and Christine came outside and stood by the front door with her arms crossed. She motioned to her watch, clearly annoyed that Don was late. Don got out of the car and sort of apologized and told her it had been a really long drive from California, and they'd only stopped a few times for gas and bathroom breaks, and they'd hit some traffic. That was why they were late. Christine sighed and said it was okay. She asked about the trip, and Don told her it went well. They had a great Christmas despite the, sadness over his sister's death, and it had been very meaningful just to be together. Before Sienna ran inside the house, Don pulled her in for a big hug and kiss, and then he promised to call her before bed as usual. And when he saw her again that weekend, they'd have plenty of time to test drive that new bike. When Don pulled back into his garage 10 minutes later, he noticed that the trash can at the end of his driveway was lying overturned on its side. So he parked his truck, walked down to the curb, and flipped it upright. Then he walked back up the driveway, pressed a button to close the garage door, and unlocked the door to his townhouse. And while he was taking off his shoes and jacket, he could have sworn he heard the garage door stop closing and roll back up again, as if something had maybe tripped the sensor. He stopped to listen, and now what he heard was the sound of the door actually closing again and actually hitting the ground with a soft thud. He shook his head and decided he must be imagining things. Don dragged his suitcase into the bedroom and began to unpack. All he wanted to do was just relax and not really think about anything. But when he carried his toiletries into his bathroom to put them away, he saw a small hole in the ceiling and let out a frustrated sigh. Don had been hounding his landlord about patching that hole for months, and he'd been hoping it would have been done by the time he got home. So he made a mental note to give the landlord yet another call about it in the morning. When he was finally finished unpacking, Don put his jacket and his shoes back on and then headed out to the garage to smoke a cigarette. The following morning, December 29th, at the office where Don worked, his coworker, Valerie Torres, was settling down at her desk when her phone rang. Valerie picked it up and heard Don's daughter, Sienna, on the other line. Sienna told Valerie that her dad did not call her last night and asked if he was there now at the office. So Valerie stood up and peered over at Don's desk, but it was empty. This was a little unusual, since Don was a pretty punctual guy, but it was still early, so she told Sienna not to worry. She would give Don a call now, and she was sure he would call Sienna right back. Valerie hung up and dialed Don's cell phone, but he didn't answer. So she sent him a text message, and she waited. But after half an hour, Don still hadn't replied. And now Valerie was starting to feel concerned. It was not like Don to skip work without calling in, and then ignore calls and texts too. And so Valerie discussed it with another coworker, and they decided to just go swing by Don's townhouse themselves and check on him. The sky over Don's townhouse was dark and cloudy when Valerie pulled into the driveway. She and her coworker got out of the car and walked up to the front door. Valerie knocked on the door, but to her surprise, it actually just swung right open. She looked over at her coworker, then the two of them nervously stepped inside. Valerie immediately called out Don's name, but he didn't answer, so she wandered into the living room and peeked into the bedroom, but the house seemed empty. Valerie's coworker, meanwhile, headed up the stairs to look for Don on the second floor. and Valerie headed out to the garage to see if maybe Don's truck was there. And when Valerie opened the door to the two-car garage attached to the townhouse and flipped on the light, she saw Don's truck was in its usual spot. But something else caught her eye. On the back wall of the garage, behind the neighbor's SUV, she noticed a streak of something dark red on the wall. At this point, Valerie started to feel pretty nervous. But nonetheless, she began walking towards that back wall to see what was going on over there. And as she got closer and closer, she was staring at the streak, wondering if her eyes were playing tricks on her, until finally she was close enough that she could actually look down at the space between the SUV and the red-streaked wall. And when she looked down, she screamed. A little before noon on that same day, Albuquerque police detective Matthew Kaplan pulled up in front of a two-story stucco townhouse secured with yellow crime scene tape and swarming with police officers. Two women wearing business clothes were sitting on the curb, and both of their faces were stained with tears and smeared makeup. All Detective Kaplan knew was that a man had been found dead in a garage attached to this townhouse, and now he, Detective Kaplan, was heading up the investigation. So he got out of his car and walked up to the open front door, and a policeman standing in the entryway filled him in on a few more details. The victim had been identified as Don Fluitt. The two women outside were his co-workers, who had come here to check on him when he hadn't shown up for work that morning. There were no signs of forced entry, and the women said the front door was open when they arrived. Kaplan stepped inside the townhouse into the living room, and right away he saw a brand new bicycle sitting under a Christmas tree. Then he did a slow loop through the first and second floors and noted there was a cell phone on the couch and a wallet on the kitchen counter. It didn't really look like anything had been rifled through. The drawers in the house were not hanging open, and the house generally was neat and orderly. And so on first glance, this did not appear to Kaplan like a robbery. Back on the first floor, Kaplan headed into the garage, where crime scene techs were busy photographing the scene and collecting forensic samples. Kaplan knelt down next to Don's body, which was laying face up between an SUV and the back wall. Don's throat was cut with a gaping wound that ran from one side of his neck to the other, and there were smaller cuts and scrapes near his eye, his ear, and on his hand, as if he had tried to fight back. There were also signs of blunt force trauma, as if he had been hit by an object like a baseball bat or maybe just a fist. And when Kaplan looked closely, he saw burst capillaries on Don's eyes and eyelids, which he knew were commonly a sign of strangulation. This killing was unusually violent and gruesome, which Kaplan knew meant this was likely personal. Kaplan stood up to examine the blood that was spattered on the walls and refrigerator above Don's body, and the bloody handprints on the side of Don's truck. There was no blood on the floor around Don. However, it sort of appeared like somebody had recently mopped and maybe tried to clean up the blood afterwards. That's when Kaplan noticed an empty bottle of bleach on top of the washer nearby. So he walked over, he opened up the washer, and sure enough, he found piles of wet towels inside that actually still smelled like bleach. Just then, a crime scene tech came over carrying luminol spray, which is a chemical used by law enforcement to detect blood. And so Kaplan stepped back so he could spray the area, and then Kaplan followed him around as he made his way through the house. The luminol spray did pick up traces of blood on the kitchen floor and the sink too, and Kaplan figured the suspect had tried to clean up the crime scene in the garage and then wash their hands or the murder weapon in the kitchen before leaving. But it is much harder to scrub a murder scene than people realize, and so as Kaplan left the house, he was feeling fairly hopeful that the crime scene techs would eventually recover some of the killer's DNA. Kaplan stepped through the front door just as a car pulled up and parked at the end of the driveway. A man got out of the car and pushed past the crime scene tape, and immediately Kaplan put his hands up to stop him. This man looked totally flustered, and he introduced himself as Benny Ruiz, the landlord, and asked what the police were doing on his property. When Kaplan told Benny that his tenant, Don Fluitt, had been murdered, Benny gasped, then started talking a mile a minute. He said Don was a devoted father and a religious man who would open up his home to anyone and that nobody would want to kill him. But then Benny paused and made a face like something was just occurring to him. And he said that, actually, there was one lead he could think of. He told Kaplan that Don did charity work with the homeless, and he said it was possible that somebody from the street could have maybe broken into Don's house and killed him. After Kaplan finished talking to Benny, he sent him on his way, and then he just stood on Dawn's driveway, thinking about what Benny had said. Based on the extreme violence of the murder, and the fact that nothing appeared to be stolen, he doubted very much that this had just been a break-in by a random homeless person. He thought it was much more likely that Dawn's killer was someone Dawn knew, and maybe even someone who had a key, based on the fact that there was no evidence of forced entry. And since Dawn was a big and muscular guy, and it was clear he had fought back with his attacker, Kaplan figured he was probably looking for a strong, potentially big male suspect. The question was, who would want to kill Dawn Fluid? From what the landlord and the two co-workers who had called 911 had said, Dawn seemed to be a really stand-up guy. If he had any dark secrets, they were very well hidden. The next day, December 30th, Detective Kaplan went to the house of Dawn's ex-wife, Christine White, and her husband, Terry White. Kaplan had spoken to Christine the day before just to break the news about her ex-husband's death, and also to see what she might know about the murder. Christine hadn't had any ideas about who would have wanted to hurt Dawn, but she'd mentioned that he used to have a problem with road rage, and he had just finished a 12-hour drive, so, maybe he had gotten into it with another driver, and maybe they had followed him home. But she also said their daughter had been with him, and she didn't mention anything about that. The only other thing Christine could think of was that Dawn had actually told her that his dog was acting skittish when he had gotten back from that road trip. Kaplan had quickly ruled out Christine as a suspect because she had an airtight alibi. Dawn had dropped Sienna off at Christine's around 7:45 the night he was killed, and then she and Sienna had spent the rest of the night together. Her road rage idea seemed as unlikely as the landlord's theory that a random homeless person had broken in. And the information about the dog was interesting, but not particularly helpful in identifying a suspect. But now Kaplan was back at Christine's house because he still needed to speak to her husband, Terry, who had been out of town last night for work since he was a truck driver and often worked long shifts at odd hours. But as the husband of Dawn's ex-wife, he was a natural suspect. When Kaplan rang the doorbell, Terry opened the door and greeted the detective with a polite smile. Kaplan entered the living room, where Christine and Sienna were sitting, and said hello, and then asked them to leave so he could speak to Terry in private. Terry sat down in an armchair across from Kaplan. He seemed calm and friendly as he told the detective that he and Dawn didn't have much contact with each other, but their relationship was not exactly bad. It was just awkward because of the custody battle Dawn had had with Christine. Ever since then, Terry said, he'd tried to keep the peace by just sort of avoiding Dawn. He knew Sienna loved her dad like crazy, and if he accidentally sparked a conflict, Sienna would likely take Dawn's side. As for the night of Dawn's murder, Terry told Kaplan he was at his sister's house until about 9 p.m., and then he left and he stopped at Wendy's on the way to work, and then he took a nap in his truck in the parking lot before going in for his shift. After Kaplan left and went back to the station, he immediately called Terry's sister and also Terry's boss, and they both confirmed Terry's whereabouts, which meant that Terry's alibi was solid, and Kaplan was back to square one on suspects. But while he was writing up a report on Terry's interview, his phone rang with a call from one of Dawn's neighbors. She told him she had been looking over the footage from her security camera for the night of Dawn's murder, and she found something that she thought the detective might want to see. Kaplan stopped writing his report mid-sentence and drove right to this neighbor's house, where she led him inside, to her computer, where she pressed play. Kaplan leaned in close to the screen and watched the black and white footage of the side of Dawn's townhouse shot from the top of the driveway next door. At 7:41 p.m., a few minutes after Kaplan knew that Dawn and Sienna had left for Christine's house, a hooded figure could be seen in the corner of the frame. The figure tipped over Dawn's trash can and then walked up the driveway toward Dawn's garage and disappeared from the screen. About 15 minutes later, the video showed Dawn driving into the garage and then walking out again to go pick up the trash can and then walking back up the driveway. Now, the garage door itself was not in frame, but the camera did capture a faint glow of light coming from inside Dawn's garage. Kaplan could see that light dimming, which meant the garage door was closing, but then inexplicably, the door must have begun going back up again because the light began to get bigger. And at the same time, there were several brief flashes of light, and then after the flashes, the light began to dim again, which meant the garage door closed, eventually leaving the driveway in darkness. Kaplan got a copy of this video, then left the neighbor's house and walked over to Dawn's, trying to piece together what actually happened on the video. He stood inside of Dawn's garage and held the garage door clicker in his hand, and he pressed the button to close the door. And as it closed, Kaplan walked closer until he was almost directly underneath the door's path. And then, when that happened, all of a sudden, the door stopped because Kaplan had actually tripped the sensor by going right underneath it. And as soon as he tripped the sensor, a light on the top of the garage flashed 3 times as the door not only stopped, but began going back the other way. It was clearly how the system worked if it was tripped. And so once he saw that, Kaplan thought about those strange flashes of light he saw in the video, and then also that hooded figure he had seen lurking near the garage. And all at once, it was like the pieces clicked into place. The suspect must have followed Dawn into the garage. But when they went into the garage, perhaps they tripped the sensor, and so as that door was coming down, the suspect's trying to sneak in, they trip the sensor, the door stops, there's those flashes of light, the door begins to go up again, but the suspect, not wanting Dawn to realize what's going on, rushed over, hits the button, the door shuts, Dawn is none the wiser. Unfortunately, as valuable as this footage appeared to be, Kaplan was not able to make out the dark figure's face on this security video. But, the video had given him a few extremely valuable clues. Whoever killed Dawn must have known his routine. They also must have known when he would leave to take Sienna to her mother's house, and when he would likely come back home. And they also must have known that Dawn was the type of person who, when he pulled into his driveway and saw that overturned trash can, that he wouldn't just let it sit there. He would deal with it that night. He would go down there and he would turn it upright. And when Dawn was doing that, that would give the killer an opportunity to sneak into the garage. And all of this meant that the suspect didn't just know Dawn. They had to have known him very well. Detective Kaplan spent weeks speaking to everyone who knew Dawn, from coworkers to friends to his entire family, including his first wife and the 2 kids he shared with her, Tiffany and Josh, who had gone to live in Oklahoma with their mom after the divorce. When Kaplan reached the kids, who were now young adults, they said they had mostly stayed on good terms with their dad. However, they said that wasn't true of some of the other members of their family. They told Kaplan the person he should be investigating was Dawn's own brother, Dennis. They said that Dawn and Dennis had had a falling out about a year earlier, but somehow, after Dawn's death, Dennis had gotten the keys to Dawn's townhouse, and he'd been out there boxing things up and basically taking control over everything ever since. Now, Dennis was apparently telling the family that he was just trying to help, but Tiffany and Josh, they weren't sure they believed that. Towards the end of January 2017, so nearly a month after Dawn was murdered, Kaplan brought Dawn's brother, Dennis, into the Albuquerque police station for questioning. And seated across the interrogation table, Dennis seemed a little keyed up, but Kaplan couldn't tell whether he was nervous about the interview because he was guilty or irritated about it because he was innocent. Dennis said that the feud between him and his brother had started after their father had passed away in October of 2015. A little over a year earlier. The family had reached an agreement over what to do with their dad's possessions, but Dawn had violated that agreement by actually keeping one of their father's cars instead of selling it. The argument had spiraled from there, and pretty soon, Dennis said that he and Dawn were no longer on speaking terms. Dennis said he had reached out that fall and tried to reconnect, but he said Dawn never returned his calls. Dennis said he had hoped that they could at some point patch things up, if they just tried a little bit harder. But then Dennis said he had gotten the call that Dawn was dead. Kaplan narrowed his eyes as Dennis finished the explanation. He didn't really buy the reconciliation story, and Dennis's only alibi was that he was home alone when his brother was killed. So Kaplan decided to push. He asked Dennis why he'd started rooting through Dawn's house the minute the crime scene was cleared. And at this, Dennis began to get pretty defensive. He insisted he only wanted to spare the rest of his family the pain of having to do that themselves. Besides, he said, his hard work settling Dawn's affairs had actually led him to a lead about the murder that he wanted Kaplan to look into. And that was that just a few days after the murder, he'd walked into Dawn's house and found the landlord, Benny Ruiz, standing inside with no good explanation for what he was doing there. Dennis said he had heard from Don's neighbors that Don and this landlord had been going back and forth over some hole that the landlord was supposed to repair but hadn't yet. And Dennis just thought it was extremely odd that Benny would just walk into a crime scene, even if he did technically own the place. Kaplan sat back in his chair, remembering Benny Ruiz coming to the house on the day Don's body was found. Benny had been very quick to suggest, without any evidence, that maybe a homeless person could have broken in and murdered Don. Maybe, Kaplan thought now, Benny had just been trying to deflect suspicion away from himself. The next day, Kaplan brought Benny Ruiz into the station for an interview. Like Don's brother Dennis, Benny did not have a solid alibi for the night Don was killed. But he could explain why Dennis had found him inside of Don's house on that day. He said he was only there to feed the dog because nobody was looking after it during the first few days following Don's death. Benny then leaned across the table and told Kaplan that if there were one person he should be looking into, it was Dennis. Benny said that from the moment Dennis arrived, he'd been acting really weird. Benny said he owned another townhouse a few blocks away from Don's, and Dennis had apparently asked if he could rent it so he could move some of Don's stuff into it and set it up as a new home for Sienna. Benny had found this strange, and when he ran a background check on Dennis, he discovered he had a criminal record for assault and disorderly conduct, so he had told him no. Now, Kaplan already knew about the criminal record because he had run Dennis's name before bringing him in for questioning. But now, listening to this account from the landlord, he wondered why, after a year of estrangement, Dennis was suddenly so interested in his brother's life. But as the weeks passed, Kaplan just couldn't make a case against Dennis. In fact, he couldn't make a case against anybody. Neither Dennis nor Benny had alibis that could prove they weren't the killer, but there was also nothing that proved either of them were. The portrait of Don, as a loving father and a man of faith who had reformed himself after some mistakes in his youth, appeared to be completely accurate. Don's most recent ex-wife, Christine, had fought with Don, over custody, but that battle seemed to have cooled off, and both she and her new husband Terry had alibis. Don also didn't appear to have any girlfriends he could have been fighting with. And so there just didn't seem to be anybody who truly wanted Don dead. In February, so about 6 weeks after the murder, the local newspaper ran a front-page article saying the police had no suspects and no evidence. And when Kaplan read it, he had to admit that it was more or less the truth. The breakthrough that Kaplan desperately needed wouldn't come until March of 2017, so 12 weeks into the investigation. On that day, he got a call from the forensics lab, and they told him a key piece of evidence had just come in. And the person who had made this critical piece of evidence possible was Don Fluitt himself. Based on forensic evidence, interviews, and the police investigation, here's what police believe happened to Don Fluitt on the night of December 28, 2016. The killer waited in the darkness right outside of Don's house until the garage door opened at about 7:40 p.m. At that point, Don drove off with his daughter in the truck, and so the killer immediately darted forward and tipped over a garbage can, and then retreated back to the shadows to wait. The killer had been nursing a grudge against Don for a long time. It annoyed them that everyone thought Don was so great, because the killer knew that until just a few years earlier, Don had been this drug-abusing loser with 2 kids he didn't even care for, and another one who he deserved to lose in Sienna. But for some reason, nobody else saw Don for what he truly was. So the killer had bided their time for as long as they could stand it, but finally, they had had enough. Don was just a dark cloud hovering over their life constantly, and he had to go. The killer knew Don well enough to figure out his schedule. They knew he was due to drop his daughter off at her mother's that evening, and that he'd be coming home alone after that, and that before he went to bed, he would go into the garage to smoke a cigarette. The killer clutched a tire thumper in their hand, which is a small wooden bat used to check tire pressure, and as they clutched it, they felt their heart race with anticipation. Finally, just before 8 p.m., Don came back, and while he was out fixing the trash can, the killer snuck into the garage. They hid behind a vehicle as Don walked back up the driveway and pressed a button to close the garage door, and then opened the door to his own townhouse. At that point, the killer snuck out from behind the vehicle to get into position, and as they did this, they accidentally tripped the garage door sensor, sending the door rolling back up and sending those lights flashing. And so thinking fast, the killer rushed over to the panel on the wall and pressed the button again to close the garage door. Then they held their breath, listening for any movement inside the townhouse that would suggest Dawn was like, "What's going on?" and coming out to check. But Dawn didn't seem to notice. And so the killer breathed out a sigh of relief and took their position near the door. And then after a while, the doorknob jiggled, and the killer realized this was it. They raised their weapon, and as soon as Dawn opened the door, they struck him so hard the tire thumper broke into pieces. Then they punched Dawn again and again with their bare fists, finally letting out all the rage they'd been pushing down for so long. Dawn did everything he could to fight back. I mean, he had turned his life around. He had a daughter that he loved, that he was trying to build an amazing life with. He was not just going to give up here. And so as valiantly as he could, he fought the killer. But he had been gravely injured, and when he couldn't fight anymore, he just tried to crawl under his truck and hide. But the killer pulled him out and landed one last punch to his face. Dawn stopped moving, and at that point, the killer wrapped their hands around his throat and they squeezed. But the killer wasn't done. To make sure Dawn was dead, they also went into Dawn's apartment, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, came back into the garage, knelt down, and ruthlessly slit Dawn's throat. Blood ran out of the wound and poured onto the concrete. The killer found some bleach inside and tried to clean up the mess as best as they could, but they left behind one crucial piece of evidence. Dawn was not able to save his own life, but by aggressively fighting back, he'd given investigators a clue that would solve his murder, and also ensure that in his absence, his daughter Sienna would grow up in a safe and secure home. Because the key piece of forensic evidence that was left behind that solved the case was DNA found under Dawn's fingernails that belonged to none other than Sienna's own stepfather, Terry White. It would turn out that Terry's story to the cops about being at his sister's until 9 p.m. was a lie. And so, on April 3rd, 2017, just over 3 months after Dawn's murder, Terry White was arrested and charged with murder. After his arrest, Terry cast blame on his wife, Christine, saying she was the one who put him up to it so they could have Sienna to themselves. And so Christine was also arrested and charged with murder, but the charges against her were dropped due to a lack of evidence. Terry, however, was convicted in August of 2018 of first-degree murder, aggravated burglary, and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 12 years. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Fair warning, this story is going to be tough to listen to. It's a very sad story. But if this were to happen to me and my family, I would want people to know about it. So hopefully I can do it justice. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please convince the like button to sing karaoke and give them a Rammstein song, but do not put the lyrics on the screen. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. At the University of Oregon. That summer, she was invited to go on a camping trip with some very close friends and some people she had not met before. Their destination was this beautiful spot along the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California, but as soon as they got there, Katie did not take in any of the beautiful scenery. Instead, she fixated solely on 25-year-old James Kim, who was one of those people she had not met before that was going on this trip. And for the people that were on this trip, they would say James and Katie immediately just fell in love with each other. And for the duration of this trip, they were inseparable. And then when they got back from this trip, James would actually move from Seattle to Oregon to be with Katie. And then after Katie graduated from college, the two got married in Las Vegas and then settled in San Francisco. James, who loved technology and always had, was quickly hired by a tech company to try out new technology and then write a review for the average consumer. Basically, James got paid to play with toys, and so he loved his job. The couple also opened 2 boutique stores in San Francisco. One was an apothecary and the other sold eccentric clothing, and those 2 shops were managed by Katie full-time. By 2006, the Kim family had become very successful financially, and they had grown in size. They had a 4-year-old daughter named Penelope and a 7-month-old daughter named Sabine. Katie and James both adored their kids, but James especially was known for blowing off virtually everything and anyone to be with his daughters. In fact, his friends and family would say you couldn't even have a conversation with James if his daughters were in the room, because James would get distracted and just stare at his daughters and then would eventually just leave mid-conversation to go play with them. James was also known to bring his daughters to work virtually every chance he got, even if it really wasn't allowed at this company. On Friday, November 17th, James, Katie, and their 2 daughters loaded up into their station wagon and then drove north to Seattle. They planned on spending Thanksgiving with James's aunt and uncle who lived in the city. And also, James and Katie were considering leaving San Francisco and moving elsewhere, and Seattle seemed like a natural landing spot for them. So this trip served nicely as a chance to see family and to explore the area. And so late on Friday night, after a very long trip, they finally arrive in Seattle, and for the next couple of days, they have a wonderful time visiting with family and having Thanksgiving dinner. On Friday, November 24th, so a day after Thanksgiving, James, Katie, and their daughters loaded back up into the station wagon early in the morning. They said bye to James's aunt and uncle, and then they hit the road. But instead of just driving straight all the way to San Francisco, which would have taken the entire day and then some, they decided to make a stop in Portland, Oregon, where one of Katie's very close friends from college was going to meet them for lunch. And so after about 3.5, 4 hours, they arrive in Portland, they meet Katie's friend, and they have this nice lunch. And then afterwards, the family retired to a hotel where they crashed for the night. The next morning, the plan was originally to just get in the car and then drive all the way back to San Francisco. But Katie suggested to James that instead of just driving all day, why don't we just stay here for part of the day, leave in the afternoon, and we'll stop somewhere between here and home. We'll break up the drive one more time. James thought it was a great idea. They pulled out the map, and Katie found a nice family-friendly vacation spot that was almost exactly halfway between where they were and home. It was called the 22-Ton Lodge, and it was located on the coast of Oregon in a town called Gold Beach. And so James and Katie think, perfect, this is exactly what we needed. Katie calls the lodge, and she makes reservations for that night. And so that afternoon, after the family spent their nice day in Portland, they hopped in the car and they began traveling south towards the 22-Ton Lodge. At about 8:30 p.m., the family was still on the road making their way when James got really hungry and said, let's pull over and get a bite to eat. So the family pulls over at a Denny's restaurant in Central Oregon. They go inside, and then after a quick bite to eat, they get back out and they're on the road at 9 p.m. From the Denny's to the lodge was about a 2.5-hour drive. But after driving for 2 more hours, James realized they had missed a turn. So he told Katie about it, they looked at the map, and they realized if they were to backtrack all the way to that turn, it would add several more hours onto their trip. And so they began looking for an alternative path. And they found one. Instead of going all the way west to the coast and then all the way south to this lodge, which was the original plan, they could just go south from where they were all the way until they were parallel with this lodge. And then from there, they could just cut west along this road called Bear Camp Road. It would basically go straight to their destination. But what this map did not do a good job of explaining was just how dangerous Bear Camp Road was. It started at 900 feet of elevation, but very quickly went all the way up to 4,000 feet of elevation before it went over the backside of this mountain down to Gold Beach and where this lodge was. While the road is paved, it's incredibly narrow and it's basically cut into a mountainside, and so there's very steep drop-offs throughout most of this ride, and there are no guardrails protecting people from falling off. The summer is really the only time people should be on Bear Camp Road because that's when the road is maintained. In the winter, the road is not plowed, it's not maintained, and so even a light snowstorm could make the road totally impassable. And the road cuts through a very remote section of Oregon where there's just not many people around. So if you get in trouble out there, you're probably on your own. But the Kims were not aware of the dangers this road possessed, and so after going south for a while, they did turn on to Bear Camp Road and began slowly driving up the mountain. And so as James is driving, Katie falls asleep in the passenger seat, the girls fall asleep in back, and outside it begins to snow. An hour later, Katie wakes up from her sleep, and the first thing she notices is outside, it is snowing so hard that James now has the windshield wipers on full blast, and still you could barely see out the front windshield. She looked at her husband, and he was hunched over, white-knuckling the steering wheel, looking intently out the window, and she says to him, what's going on? Should we stop? Should we turn around? And James, without even looking at her, says, yeah, honey, I do want to turn around, but the road is so narrow, we can't. And then he would tell his wife that earlier, they had actually driven through a fork in the road where there was enough space to turn around, and so now he was just hopeful that there'd be another fork somewhere that would allow them to turn around. And so Katie was not excited about the idea, but she trusted James and said, okay, let's keep going. And so James just continues driving up this mountain pass, and you got to understand, they are driving on basically a cliff. On the left side, left of James, is just a sheer drop off, and the road is totally slick from the snow. And so periodically, as James is driving, even though he's only going about 5 miles an hour, he would begin to slip and slide, and he's right on the edge of this cliff. And so it was a very, very stressful ride, and after several more miles of this, they were not reaching any turnaround. In fact, they would have to periodically stop on inclines, put up the emergency brake, and one of them would have to get out and clear branches and rocks out of this tiny little road to continue onward. And so finally, Katie says to James, you gotta stop, you gotta back out of here. That's our only choice right now. And so James put the car in reverse, and he opens his car door so he can look down at the edge of this cliff to make sure he doesn't accidentally veer off of it. And so very slowly, without even applying the gas, he began going in reverse, making sure he didn't go off the cliff. And for hours and hours they did this. This must have been so stressful. But finally, they make it to this fork in the road that James had seen much earlier, and they're able to make a decision. They had two paths they could take. They could turn around completely and drive nose out along the path they came in on all the way to the highway, but that was a very far drive, and they knew that road was treacherous and there was a cliff drop off, and it was really just as dangerous as what they had been on, and they really were not keen to be on that road considering the weather. Or they could turn left and go down the mountain on this path that was way wider than the paths they were on. It was like this huge road, and it looked like it went straight to the bottom of the mountain. And they're thinking, we don't know where this goes. The signage is not clear where this goes, but you got to figure if you're going lower in elevation, the weather will not be as bad. And maybe if you go down this road, there'll be houses, or there'll be a gas station, or there'll be something. But whatever it is, it's probably better than going that way or that way. And so James turned the car and began driving down this new road. Unfortunately, this was the worst choice they could have made. This road they were now on was this long, winding dead end that was used by loggers in the summer. Now, normally, this mistake by the Kim family would have been caught because there was supposed to be a big yellow gate that sat across this road just a little ways past this fork, blocking all traffic from proceeding any further. But vandals had recently come up and cut the lock on this gate, swung it open, and then locked it open. So the gate is completely off the road. And so as the Kims drove past where they normally would have been stopped, they didn't even see a gate. There was no gate anywhere, and so they just kept on driving. And from where this gate should have been, the road went from paved to dirt and full of potholes, and it narrowed considerably. The couple drove for 15 miles on this very tight, winding road that once again was on a cliffside until finally they reached another fork in the road where they could either go right or they could go straight, but there was no sign telling them which way led to what. And so James stopped the car right in the middle of this intersection, and he and Katie look at each other and they know they're in trouble. So they get their phones out and they try calling for help, but they have no service. And so as they're struggling to place calls, one of them realizes it's no longer snowing. It's actually raining, and a lot of the snow on the ground seems to be getting washed away. And so after not being able to place calls for several minutes, they decide, you know what, it's 2 a.m, we're tired, let's sleep here, we'll leave the car running, it'll be nice and warm, and when we wake up in the morning, this rain will most likely have washed away the snow, and we can just drive out of here. And so the two are kind of relieved as they're saying this out loud that this situation is not nearly as bad as it seems, we'll be just fine. And so Katie, James, their 2 daughters, they fall asleep with the car running. It's nice and warm. And when they wake up, Katie and James realize it's gotten much, much worse. At some point in the night after they fell asleep, the temperature must have dropped again, and that rain became very heavy snow. And so all the water on the ground froze, and then almost a foot of snow fell on top of it. They were stuck. But Katie and James, they didn't panic because they remembered when they first turned onto Bear Camp Road, they had seen a plow truck parked off of the side of the road. And so to them, that meant if it snowed along Bear Camp Road, it would get plowed. And so that day, the Kims just stayed inside of their car and they ate snacks and they read books and they kept the heater on and they waited to be rescued. But over the course of that entire day, nobody came down that road. No plows, no anybody. And Katie and James continuously tried their cell phones to try to punch out and get some help, but they never had any service. Also, Katie and James continuously honked the horn in case someone was in the area that might hear them, but no one ever came to their rescue. And so by the end of that Sunday night, Katie and James were really starting to get worried because they have a 4-year-old and a 7-month-old. They cannot be out here for very much longer. But they began to tell each other that, you know what, it's Sunday. Maybe the plows don't come through on Sundays. Maybe they just don't work out here on Sundays. And so tomorrow, Monday, the plows will be out here. They'll come by and they will save us. Also, Katie and James began telling each other to reassure each other that, hey, tomorrow, Monday, that's the day we were supposed to be back in San Francisco. And so people are bound to notice our absence and they will report it to police and they will come out here and they will save us. So tomorrow we are going to get found. And so Katie and James, they put their 2 daughters in their car seats and James read them some bedtime stories and then the family fell asleep. The next day, Monday, the family did a lot of the same things they did the day before. They sat in their car, they kept spirits high, they tried to use their cell phones, which didn't work, they honked their horns to get people's attention, that didn't work, they tried to ration their food, and the whole time, they're keeping their eyes up each side of this road they're on in hopes a plow comes through. But all day long, no trucks, no plows, nothing comes down this road. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, the family's absence was noticed by a family friend, but they didn't report it to police because they figured the Kim family had just decided to stay out a little bit longer and they would be back soon. By Monday night, Katie and James were officially terrified. They were almost out of fuel in their car. They were almost out of food. In fact, to compensate for their low amount of food, Katie had begun not only breastfeeding her 7-month-old, but also began breastfeeding her 4-year-old. Also, outside of their car, bears began kind of assembling and checking them out. And at first, Katie and James would scream and yell and try to scare them off, but the bears ultimately were not that fazed by them. They were not aggressive, but it meant the family did not feel comfortable getting out of their car. And so they're in this very claustrophobic situation where they are literally trapped inside of this small car where all the windows are covered with snow and they can't go anywhere. They can't call anyone. They're running out of their supplies. I mean, this is a terrifying situation to be in. Katie and James had been really strong to this point, but around this time, they began to act scared, and their kids picked up on it, and they started acting scared and fearful. And so the parents were trying their best to calm them down and tell them everything's going to be fine and they're going to get out of here soon. But in reality, Katie and James knew that if they didn't get found soon, they were probably going to die. The next day when they woke up, which was Tuesday, again, no cars or trucks came down either road. There was no plows. The snow just continued to pile up, and the food was running unbelievably low to the point where James actually left the car and went out looking for bear droppings because there's bears all over the place now, and he would pull the berries out of their droppings, and he and Katie began eating those. But after a while, they decided that was not a good idea because they might poison themselves. Their daughters, who the day before had been acting out of fear and anxiety, were now lethargic and quiet. And the parents' response to this was to start fighting with each other about whose fault this was, when in reality, they were just totally scared about what might happen to them. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, the family had still not been reported to police. And so that night, Tuesday night, the Kim family once again huddled up inside of their car. James read the kids' books, and then they all fell asleep. The next morning, Wednesday, they ran out of gas for their car. and so they had no way to heat themselves. And so James got the spare tire out of the back of the car, and he rounded up some magazines inside of the car, and he lit a fire for the family to stand around and try to warm up by. And it worked, but the fire very quickly died out, and they couldn't find any wood that wasn't soaking wet to put on it. And so before long, they did not have a fire. And so all day that day, James and Katie were desperately looking up the road in hopes that a car or truck would come through. They never did. James and Katie tried their cell phones repeatedly, but they never got service. They honked their horns and they screamed out for help, but nobody heard them. And so before long, it was dark again, and the family was huddled up inside of their now freezing car, and all they could hear outside was the sounds of bears marching around the area. And so I'm sure James and Katie thought to themselves, I wonder if we'll survive the night. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, that family friend who had noticed the Kims were gone on Monday, she did go to the police on Wednesday afternoon and reported them missing. And so a search party was being organized that night, but of course the Kim family would have no way of knowing that. The next morning, Thursday, the Kim family woke up, they survived the night, but at this point, James and Katie are speaking openly about the real possibility that they all might die. In fact, Katie says to James, you have to promise me if our 2 kids die out here, you have to kill me too. And James said he would. At this point, Katie and James do not believe a truck or a car or anything is going to drive down this road and save them. They believe their only hope of being rescued is by sending a smoke signal up into the air that a pilot might see. So they pull off all 4 tires of their car, and then they pull everything out of the car that might burn, and they stack that on the tires, and that included Penelope's prized stuffed lamb. And then once they had their big pile, they lit it on fire, and fairly quickly, a large black billowing cloud of smoke was going straight up to the sky. And for a minute, the Kim family was very optimistic that they were about to be found, that certainly someone was going to see the smoke and come find them. But unfortunately, the fire burned out very quickly, they couldn't light it again, and nobody flew overhead. And so before long, the family is once again huddled inside of their freezing cold car that night. There's bears walking around outside. They're basically out of food. Their kids aren't even crying anymore. They're just silent and cold and miserable. And as they're all shivering and trying to stay warm, James realizes he needs to do something drastic or his family's going to die. And so the next morning, Friday, when they get up, James tells Katie that he had been studying the map, and there's a town about 4 miles east called Galice that he believes he can get to in about 2 hours. Katie immediately said, no, you cannot leave us. We need you here. There's probably a search party out there looking for us right now. We need to stay together so we can all be found. But James's instincts were telling him that no one was coming for them, or no one was going to actually find them in time. And so their only hope was if he ventured off and found help. And so Katie finally reluctantly agrees to let him go because he seemed really confident. And so at 7:45 a.m. that morning, James gave his 2 daughters a big hug and a kiss, told them he loved them and he would see them soon, and then he hugged his wife and said he loved her, and then he turned around and walked up the road out of sight. At the same time, unbeknownst to the Kim family, hundreds of searchers and helicopters are all over Bear Camp Road looking for them. 2 days later, on Sunday, December 3rd, so a week after the family had originally gotten stuck, a helicopter pilot that was part of the search effort was flying around Bear Camp Road when he noticed footprints in the snow below. When he started following these footprints, and eventually the footprints kind of disappeared under some trees, and then he couldn't pick them up again, and so without that much fuel left, he decided he would just backtrack and follow the footprints back to their origin. And so he retraced these footprints for quite a while until he came to a clearing, and in the middle of the clearing was a car, and next to the car was Katie waving an umbrella back and forth. The pilot immediately knew who he was looking at, but he didn't have enough fuel to actually land and pick her and her family up. And so instead, he just hovered down as low as he could, and he made good eye contact with her to reassure her that I see you and we're coming for you. And then he marked on the map where they were. He flew off to the search headquarters, and just minutes later, another helicopter was spun up. They flew to that same location, and they were able to land in that clearing. And as soon as the pilot got out, he saw Katie running up to him, carrying her 2 daughters, who looked like they were in pretty good shape. And she's crying tears of joy, and she's thanking him profusely. And then when she's right up in front of him, she says, are you here because of my husband? Did James tell you where we were? And the pilot looked visibly confused. Katie picked up on it, and she explained how just 2 days earlier, James had left to go to the town of Galice to get help, and he still hadn't come back yet. And so at this point, the pilot understood what was happening, and so he looked down,
And he said, "No, ma'am, we still have not found James." Katie was devastated and she cried as she and her daughters were loaded into the helicopter and airlifted out of the forest and brought to a hospital. There they would make full recoveries. Meanwhile, the search effort, which had been all over Bear Camp Road, was suddenly focused exclusively on the area around where their car was. And professional trackers were brought in to look for James's tracks, and they found them fairly quickly and began following them. James, after departing his family to go look for help, which must have been the most difficult decision he had ever made in his entire life. He loved his family more than anything, and he had to abandon them in the middle of the wilderness with no food, with no power, and he has no idea if he'll ever see them again. And so after leaving them behind, he walked 3 miles up the road they came in on, and then instead of just continuing on that road in the direction of Galice, he deviated and walked off the road. He actually went straight down one of the cliffs until he hit a river. And it's believed that maybe he saw the river from up on the road and thought that would be a faster way to get to Galice. But either way, he got down to the river, and as he walked, he would leave behind him little bits of torn clothing and torn paper to create a trail of where he was going, presumably so if he needed to, he could backtrack to his family. And so he gets down to this river, and for several miles he walks downstream. And then after being gone for at least 2 hours and not reaching the town of Galice, he must have realized he had either gone the wrong way, and that's why he had not hit the town, or he had miscalculated the distance, and that's why he had not hit the town. But either way, he did not turn around and go back to his family. Instead, he pressed on, believing he was their only hope. And so on he went, crossing over rivers, getting totally soaked in frigid water. He went up and down mountains all over these totally rugged areas in nothing but street clothes. He had sneakers, pants, and a jacket on. He had no food, he had no water, and he just kept on going until it was nightfall, and he had covered about 10 miles at this point, and he laid down and he went to sleep. And that night must have been absolutely horrible as he thought about his family that was alone in the woods somewhere. He probably wondered if they were still alive. And the temperature was in the 30s, and again, he's just in street clothes. But he survives the night, and so the next morning, that Saturday, he gets up and he's right back at it, despite the fact that he was physically wrecked at this point. But for him, he didn't care. He was doing it for his family. And so all day he hiked in and out of freezing cold streams, up and down mountains, until finally he found himself at the bottom of this deep ravine next to a river where he just fell to his knees, fell forward, and died. He had literally just kept on going, looking for help for his family until he eventually succumbed to hypothermia. James's body was located 2 days after his wife and his daughters were successfully rescued. It would turn out the town of Galice was not 4 miles away from the family's car. It was about 15 miles away, but that's from point A to point B on a map, like a straight line. But when you actually are hiking in the wilderness, you don't go in straight lines because there's mountains and there's rivers and there's things that get in the way. And so in order to get to Galice from where their car was, James would have had to travel 30 or 40 miles, zigging and zagging up over 4 different mountains. And so this was a suicide mission from the start. James ultimately covered 16 miles through some of the most treacherous terrain in the country, wearing nothing but his street clothes. The professional trackers that followed this 16-mile trail to his body, they called his journey superhuman. The helicopter pilot would later say he never would have found Katie and the girls had he not spotted those footprints first and then traced them all the way back to that clearing. And it would turn out those footprints were made by James after he left his family and walked off to get help. And so even though it cost him his life, James did ultimately save his family. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please convince the like button to sing karaoke and then give them a Rammstein song, but don't put the lyrics up on the screen. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and a whole bunch of stuff. You can buy it at shopmrballen.com. Also, go follow our shop's Instagram page called Shop Mr. Ballen. There you can find deals and upcoming promotions. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballen. We also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballen Shorts where we upload random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below.
So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, we're going to look at 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I will share the photo that is famously associated with them. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please build the like button's confidence way up and tell them to run for student body president. Help them hand out flyers, help them with their speech, and then when there are 3 waterfalls spanning the Canadian-USA border that combined make up the famous Niagara Falls. They have a max height of about 170 feet at their highest point, and every second, 700,000 gallons of water tumbles over the edge. The rapids above the falls are some of the strongest and most violent in the world, with a max speed of about 40 miles per hour right before you hit the edge. As a result, no one's allowed to boat or swim in the final 3.2 miles of the Niagara River that feeds into the falls. But back in the day, there was no such restriction. On the evening of July 16th, 1853, 3 men were working on a small barge anchored in the Niagara River about a half-mile away from the edge of the falls. Once they were done with work, the way they would get back to shore is by taking a rowboat and taking it downstream to this small island called Goat Island that sits right on the edge of the falls. Now, in order to get to that island, you would have to traverse the rapids, but it was only a couple hundred feet away, and because they worked here all the time, they had traversed the rapids many times before without incident. But this time, as soon as they got in, one of their oars broke. And so they weren't able to control their boat, and very quickly they got dragged into the rapids, started getting spun around, and then it capsized. Although they desperately tried to swim to shore, the rapids were just too strong, and 2 of the men were swept away to their death. But one man, Joseph Avery, was lucky enough that when he fell in, he drifted down and grabbed onto this tree root that was sticking out of the water. And so he pulled himself about halfway up out of the water, he caught his breath, and he's looking around, and he can't believe he survived. But he wasn't out of the water yet, so to speak, because he was in the middle of these rapids and there was nobody on shore. It was getting late. His 2 buddies have drowned, and when he yelled out, the rapids were so loud nobody could hear him. And the log he was holding onto was totally slick, and so he had to grip it as hard as he could, otherwise he would just slip back into the water. And so all night, with half of his body in the water, he gripped onto this branch as tight as he could and just prayed he would survive. The next morning, when tourists arrived, they noticed Joseph out on this log and they waved to him. And Joseph, who had used all his strength just to hold onto this log all night, was not only fatigued, but also was becoming hypothermic. And he very carefully removed one hand and he waved back. The tourists immediately notified authorities and a rescue effort was launched. And because it was too dangerous to take a boat and try to drive down to Avery and pull him out that way because he was right near the edge of the falls, what they did is they went up to this little bridge that was upstream of Joseph and they released rafts and small boats, hoping that one of them, just by chance, would get caught up on that log and he could grab it, and then Joseph could climb in, throw the rope out, and get pulled to shore. But unfortunately, after dozens of attempts, nothing came close to Joseph. Their next plan was to tie a long tether onto one boat and then guide it down the river until it reached Joseph, and this worked. But when Joseph climbed into the boat, it immediately began to capsize. And witnesses would say Joseph stood up, and as he was falling backwards, he threw his hands up in the air like he was surrendering. He let out a final scream and then fell under the turbulent waters, and then seconds later, he was swept off the falls to his death. Here is the final photo of Joseph Avery. It was taken by a journalist right before that boat with a tether attached to it arrived in front of him. Chad Lawhorn woke up in his Nashville home around 3 a.m. on April 8, 2018. He had taken a long flight back from San Francisco the night before, so his sleep schedule was all messed up. Not feeling very tired, he decided to go downstairs to the kitchen to get a snack. And as he was walking down the stairs, he pulled out his phone and he saw a notification from his Venmo account. His younger brother, Casey, had sent him $250, and attached to it was a single word note. It just said damages. Knowing his brother had long struggled with his mental health, Chad was concerned he was getting ready to hurt himself, and he had sent him this money as a way to compensate for the emotional toll he was about to inflict on him. Chad didn't even change out of his pajamas. He grabbed his keys, hopped in his car, and began driving the 2 hours to East Ridge, Tennessee, where his younger brother and his mother lived. On the ride there, he called both of them dozens of times, but he never got through. When he finally pulled onto their street, he looked down the road and he saw dozens of police cars and TV crews, and there was yellow crime scene tape all around their property. Chad just stopped the car right in the middle of the road and just stared. And he didn't know how long he was there for, but at some point one of the police officers noticed him and walked up and knocked on his window. And when the officer found out who he was talking to, the news Chad was delivered was far worse than anything he was expecting. 24 hours earlier, Chad's younger brother, Casey, who was 23, was spending the day with one of his very good friends named Avery. They had gone to a comic book store to play Magic the Gathering, and then afterwards they headed back to Casey's house to go to bed. Around 12:30 in the morning, Avery fell asleep on the living room floor, and as Casey was getting ready to go to bed himself, his mother called him and asked if he could come pick her up at the bar. And so Casey begrudgingly agreed to do it. He drove to pick her up, and when he saw her, he could tell she was totally intoxicated, and the entire ride home, she just pleaded with Casey not to hurt himself because it would totally devastate her if he ever did that. Casey hated when she talked to him that way, and apparently she did this all the time. When they got back to the house, Casey dropped his mom off, and then he went up to his bedroom where he retrieved a rifle he had stolen from a friend. And then he paced around his room for a while, getting mentally prepared for what he was about to do. And when he felt ready, he left his room, he went downstairs to the living room where Avery was still asleep on the ground, and he placed the rifle up against the side of his head, and he fired one shot, killing his friend instantly. Once he was dead, Casey went upstairs to his mother's room. When he got to the threshold of her room, he pushed the door open and it was totally dark, but he could tell his mother was still awake in her bed. He raised his rifle and he fired, except the gun didn't go off. It jammed. His mother, because she was so intoxicated, did not hear the shot ring out, and she didn't really know what her son was doing in the doorway, so she did not raise any alarms. And so Casey just turned around, walked into the hallway where there was light, he fixed the jam in his gun, he turned back around, and this time his mother was now out of bed because the family dog was barking like mad, and so his mother was trying to calm the dog down, and she looked up and saw her son standing in the doorway carrying a gun, and so she just kind of froze and stared at him, and that's when Casey, without any hesitation, raises his rifle and fires 2 shots, and then his gun jams again. Now, neither of those 2 shots were fatal, although one of them did strike her in the arm. And even though she was intoxicated, she was now fully aware her son is trying to kill her. And so she's screaming at him, "Why are you doing this? You're killing me!" Casey was totally unfazed. He flipped on the lights, he fixed the jam, he re-aimed at his mother, and his mother, who was still just standing next to the bed, looking at her son, wondering why this was happening, and Casey just aimed and took 2 shots, and these would be fatal. After that, he went downstairs and robbed Avery, and then he hopped in his car and he drove all the way to Mississippi, where within 24 hours, he would take his own life. We know all of these details because shortly after he committed these crimes, Casey posted a lengthy confession to Facebook detailing exactly what happened and what he did. This is a screenshot of the actual post. It's extremely graphic and it's since been removed from the social media platform. In his post, Casey says he feels extremely bad for his older brother Chad because he knows this is going to be extremely hard for him, and he encourages people to help his brother during this insanely difficult time. While he doesn't provide a specific motive for why he committed these crimes, he does say at the end of his confession that he's been thinking about murder a lot lately and wanted to know how it felt. But after doing it, he says he barely felt anything at all. In 1996, 28-year-old Paljor Tawang was offered the opportunity of a lifetime. Born and raised in a valley at the foot of the Himalayas, he was chosen to lead the first ever Indian ascent of the north face of the highest peak in the world, Mount Everest. He had left school after the 10th grade and joined the highly competitive and prestigious Indo-Tibetan Border Police. Created in 1962 in response to their domineering neighbor, China, the Border Police specialized in high-altitude landscapes. They had to, given that the boundary between India and China ran through the very rugged Himalayan mountain range. 12 years after joining the Border Police, Paljor was an expert climber and very well liked by his peers, making him an obvious candidate for one of the Border Police's most ambitious missions to date. While Paljor's mother was full of pride for her son's work and accomplishments, he didn't think she would be very supportive if she knew how dangerous the mission he was going on was. And so he told her he was climbing a different mountain, although she would find out through friends where he was actually going, and she would plead with him not to go, but Paljor was not about to change his mind. He was excited and he was confident. In May of that year, Paljor said bye to his family, and he and the other hikers set out on their journey. At first, it went extremely well. The weather was perfect, and the men seemed to be having an excellent time. but their luck would not hold. The team's final assault on the north face of Mount Everest was marked by mistakes, bad decisions, and very bad weather. According to the official report on the ascent, those problems started on the morning of May 10th when Paljor and the other 3 climbers woke up late. Instead of leaving base camp at 3:30 a.m. like they were planning to, they didn't leave until 8 a.m., so 4.5 hours late. Making matters worse, the weather continued to deteriorate with a blizzard moving in, creating near zero visibility. But even under the best of circumstances, Mount Everest is still a force of nature. The summit may be covered in colorful ropes and flags and climbers with their high-tech, shiny, beautiful gear, accompanied by a small army of Sherpas, but the outward appearance of commercialization is deceptive. Since 1924, at least 300 people have died on Mount Everest. The death-to-summit ratio is a staggering 4%. The extremely high altitude, Everest reaches 5.5 miles into the sky, not only makes physical exertion extremely difficult, it affects your judgment and decision-making, and not in a good way. Climbers and scientists have a name for the final half mile of Mount Everest. It's called the death zone, because literally, while you're up there, you're dying. Oxygen is so limited up there that your cells just begin to die, and extremely fit people will have heart attacks and strokes and experience debilitating altitude sickness. The conditions are so severe that people have died from exhaustion just standing in line waiting to reach the summit. But one of the biggest killers in the death zone is something called summit fever. When you get to that point in the climb, you are so close to reaching your goal. People will disregard safety and keep going on when really they should turn around and go back. Paljor and his 3 teammates were given strict orders to turn around at 3 p.m. if they had not reached the summit yet. But because of their late start, when 3 p.m. rolled around, they were not at the summit, they were in the death zone. One of the climbers who was with Paljor was the commander, and so at 3 p.m. when they were supposed to stop and turn around, he was at the very back of the climbing stack. And so he stopped and he yelled up to Paljor and the others and tried to get them to stop too so they could go back down, but either they didn't hear him or they just ignored him. Already suffering from frostbite and totally exhausted, he could not go any farther, so he grabbed his radio and he tried to hail them to tell them to stop and come back, but they didn't pick up their radio. And so the commander, after waiting for a few minutes, knew he had to go back down, and so he turned and began the descent. About 30 minutes later, the commander's radio crackled on again, and it was Paljor and the others, and they were informing him that they were going to make a push for the summit. They were about an hour away. And the commander said, "Stop, turn around, I'm ordering you to come back down. The weather is only getting worse." But whether they were suffering from summit fever or overconfidence, we don't know. But regardless, they refused. Frustrated and terrified for the other climbers, the commander just continued down the mountain. But 2.5 hours later, his radio crackled again, and this time it was Paljor and the others saying they had made it. They were standing on the summit of Mount Everest. The men had not just set a record for India, they had brought immeasurable honor to their country. The news sparked a huge celebration down in the base camp and also in the city of Leh, which is where the border police were located. But the party atmosphere would not last long. Shortly after the victory call, the weather turned from bad to horrible. What would later be known as the blizzard of 1996 had arrived in full fury, and by midnight that night, no one had heard from Paljol or the other 2 people he was with. And just a couple of days later, rescue climbers would confirm all 3 men had died. In the years following Paljol's death on the north base of Mount Everest, this hopeful and proud young Indian has become a sort of gruesome celebrity and landmark for the thousands of climbers that make it up into the death zone. Except now he's widely known on the internet and amongst people who are passionate about climbing the world's highest peak, not as Paljor, one of the first Indians to climb the north base of Mount Everest, but as Green Boots, which is a reference to the bright neon green boots he was wearing when he died. For more than 20 years, he's laid near the top of Mount Everest in a small limestone cave, wearing an orange parka and blue pants, and he's curled on his side with his arms wrapped around him like he's trying to keep himself warm. Since his death, anyone climbing the north face when the snow cover is light would literally have to step over his body to get to the top. But Paljor is not the only dead body on Mount Everest. There are over 200 other dead climbers littering the slopes of the world's highest peak. It's just too dangerous and too expensive to try to get them down, and so they stay wherever they died. Which means if you climb Mount Everest, you will literally be climbing over dead bodies on your way to the summit. But of all the bodies on Mount Everest, the most famous by far is Paljor. Here is an image of Paljor, aka Green Boots. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section.
If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please build up the like button's self-confidence and convince them to run for student body president. Help them with their speech, help them hand out flyers, and then on the big day, don't vote for them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.